also on the line.
Thank you, Pat. Let's call the meeting to order and begin with the Pledge of Allegiance, please. You'll all stand, right hand over your heart. Face the flag. Please follow me in saluting the flag in our republic. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And how about, well, remain standing for just a moment, and I'd like to offer a moment of silence for all the victims of violence that we've had in the country here in the last couple days. Thank you. That and the earthquake are a reminder that we are one community and we can work together. Josh, can you do roll call, please?
Sure. We're going to shake things up since it's a special meeting, and we're going to start with our non-voting members today. Lorelei Oviatt.
Present.
John Kersey.
Here.
Don Zadiba.
Present.
Lyle Fisher.
Here.
Nick Panzer.
Here.
Wes Kassenstein.
Here.
Renee Westelusk.
Here.
Joshua Nugent. Here. David Janik.
Here.
Over the telephone, Pat Quist. I think she said she was
Present.
here.
Non-voting.
Oh, okay.
I'll clarify that.
Okay. Judy Decker. Camille Anderson.
Here.
Ed Imsond.
Here.
And Tim Carroll.
Here.
So we have a quorum.
Was that elevator music we had for a moment there? So we have a quorum. We have all members present. Thank you all for committing to do this special meeting, and I know everybody was able to make it. Pat is in Colorado visiting children who are, before they go back on deployment overseas. She is calling in, but in accordance with the Brown Act, she will not be allowed to vote, but she can listen and speak, and that is appropriate as she is the sole member on the Policy Advisory Committee for the Small Ag group. And the intent of these policy questions requested or to be discussed and our interests and issues brought forward on the intent of the board was in fact to hear from the constituents that we have and that the board members represent and the public themselves surrounding these issues. This special meeting has but one purpose, is an extension of our meeting last week regarding policy items in item number 5, I believe. I will clarify those again when we get to them today. We're going to have a presentation by Stetson that in fact combines all the information in a matrix, single matrix, and it's a little tough to see the font, so an 11 by 17 has been provided to all the members and out in front so that some of us with more seasoned eyes can more easily read it. And it will capture a lot of the information for the really 8 modeling scenarios, not allocation, not GSP scenarios. They are modeling scenarios that provide information to make decision from regarding what might be the ultimate GSP plan that that's redundant, ultimate GSP first cut. I would point out that, in fact, it is only a first draft that's a first submission that is due in 31 January, this next January 2020. And in fact, there are provisions for updates to that plan at a minimum for every 5 years. It'll likely be far more rapid than that as we expect to get more data, and we'll be talking about that piece of it in the 3 questions that were asked of us today. One piece relates to that. So I just want to go over some of the data and information that we have available to us today. We have the modeling matrix summary of the 8 runs, which includes the baseline, runs that are referred to as model number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 6 actually comprised 6.1 and 6.2. There was one minor change made in that, which Jeff Helsley from Stetson will discuss. That's the one, and that's the first one when Jeff gets on that Gary IT will display for the public as well. And as I said, there's a hard copy out front. The PAC tasking and questions handout from our last meeting is available to all. The request for clarification of the M&I terminology that was used in the PAC tasking and linking that to the language used in the modeling scenario. The sustainable management criteria presentation, all these ones are referenced. They will probably not be displayed today unless we need to have something looked at in depth. But they are references that support today's discussion. We have the agriculture pumping comparisons for question B, and groundwater storage information, which came up. That is a new one that came up in last week's PAC, and we're prepared to present that if there's discussion on that. Scenario 6 presentation from last week is 17 megabytes, and so most of you have that. It was on the website if you're connected. Some of you were not able to download it, but I think everybody has it now. And that's just scenario 6.1 and 6.2. I think it has one or two comparison slides for scenarios 3, 4, and 5, which were the genesis for the scenario 6 variants. We also have individual member comments from Nick Panzer and Pat Quist that were distributed to the PAC members. And I think Judy provided one also just before the meeting in hard copy to the members. I have not received any other written comment from PAC members or anyone else. There is, go ahead, Lyle.
I was just going to say, I have a copy of what I'm going to be talking about that I will give to you at the end, at the conclusion here.
Okay, so we'll include that, and any of these will be included in the minutes, obviously, and consolidated for the report, which we will give at next week's GA meeting.
Okay, very good.
Which tightens our timetable. I also received, actually, each PAC member received comments from the attorneys for Searles Valley Minerals, and last night comments from Meadowbrook Dairy attorney. So you each have received those, and those are primarily questions for the GA and will be forwarded to the GA and ahead of time for their meeting next week.
One additional thing, since that is part of our packet, we can comment on those letters, right?
You can comment on them to the effect that they involve the policy questions before us.
Okay.
But most of them are legal related,
right,
and
right.
GA questions.
But they both hit on one item that I would like to mention.
Yeah, let's wait until we get there.
That
Okay.
was my plan.
I have a question.
Yes.
Are written comments going to be put under the PAC committee on the website?
They should be.
Thank you. I hope they are.
Well, after the fact, they usually aren't. They usually go into the minutes. Before the fact, sometimes we're able to get them in if we have time for the review.
I believe they should be put on the website.
I don't control the website.
Understood.
Okay, with that, we're up to open public comment. I would say this is a single issue meeting, and the one agenda item will cover anything with regards to what we just discussed. So is there any public comment on items that are not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll move to item number 3, the sole purpose for the special meeting. It is a continuation of item number 5 from our last meeting, and in the interest of getting the most information out on the table, discussed and captured for report next week, I would suggest that we minimize our discussions repeating what we said last week and try to move forward. The point at which we had gotten to at the end of, or just prior to the end of last week's meeting, was we were actually into question number A, which it looks like it's too much paper I've misplaced. So Everyone has the tasks in front of them. They have seen them, reviewed them. Tasks or items 1 through 4, background, simply summarizing scenario 6, a modeling scenario, not a GSP proposal, and questions A and B, which have sub-questions inside of them. To help us further understand the background, as I mentioned earlier, we've asked Stetson to put together a matrix summarizing the results of the modeling runs, and we should focus on what we're being asked a question in A in particular, given that the entire valley inhabitants and businesses of all stripes have been mining the basin since, in overdraft, probably since the 60s. And what was modeled in those scenarios took out various levels of reserves, and specifically models 3, 4, and 5 focused on the impact of varying levels of continued pumping in the basin beyond where we stand today, given the current technical data we have in the model, what the impacts of those are on shallow wells in particular. There were some models, but incomplete, for total dissolved solids and some of the other quality issues. But in fact, and there was also assigned, and Jeff's going to explain this, a mitigation value to mitigating the damage from additional mining to those shallow wells, and how many more go shallow as you pump more or less. So Jeff Helsley, has those of you in the audience, I don't see anybody that doesn't know Jeff, has been before us. He's online, and Jeff, would you like to go through and give the background, and then we'll open it up for discussion on the questions. So Gary, please post the matrix slide.
Okay.
It's posted. The matrix slide's posted, Jeff.
Thank you. Yeah, there is a lag here on the live stream. The first pumping scenario, and we have a brief overview of the different scenarios that we modeled, and some of the outcome or results of those. I'll point out some of the highlights. Modeling scenario 1, and I consider this to be, since it was early in our evaluation of the basin, it was our first modeling run, well after our baseline, which I didn't include on here. In the baseline allocation itself, we had contacted the major pumpers in the basin and asked them what they thought they might be pumping in the future, so we could take the model after it was calibrated and project that what the pumping levels and water levels and use of storage would be out into the future if there were no management plan. And there were projections that pumping in the basin would greatly increase, and that resulted in a loss of storage or use of storage of about 1.5 million acre feet if we didn't have a management plan in place and people pumped as they thought they would to meet their needs and their interests going into the future. So I think that's a good number to keep in mind when we're looking at each of these modeling scenarios and how much water is used out of storage in each one of them. Modeling scenario 1 was our first management scenario modeling attempt, and I think it was kind of a broad attempt to look at the response of the groundwater basin to reductions in pumping and some other activities, such as use of imported water. It was essentially a 20-year ramp down of pumping. There were some allocations given. Based on those allocations, there were ramp downs. There was some cliff pumping of agriculture. That is, it was assumed that some of the large ag would continue to pump at the level they were at rather than ramp down, but that their pumping would then stop at a certain point before 2040. This project, and one of the things that made it very different from all the subsequent modeling, was on the imported water. It was assumed that imported water was available from the City of Los Angeles aqueduct, and that was recharged into the El Paso area, and then when it was needed, it was pumped up, and pipes would be constructed to bring it over to water users that might need it because their pumping had been reduced. And the result of that modeling scenario was that about 225,000 acre-feet of water was used out of storage. We then did a theoretical shallow well impact analysis out to the year 2040, which indicated that 32 shallow wells would be impacted, would no longer be able to produce water under that modeling scenario. And using a replacement well cost of $75,000 per well, it's estimated that the cost to mitigate that is to re-drill wells for those 32 that had been impacted, the cost would be a total of $2.4 million. We then worked with the TAC and the ad hoc modeling committee of the TAC that had been established to develop modeling scenario 2. Modeling scenario 2 assumed that the current levels of pumping would be maintained until the year 2025. It had 2 step downs rather than ramps in pumping. One of those step downs in 2025 was a reduction in pumping by almost all of the entities in the basin, other than the Navy and de minimis pumpers, and they stepped down by various amounts based on input from the ad hoc committee. And then there was another step down in pumping in 2030, and essentially that step down was that the water district and Cyrils stopped pumping in the basin in 2030, and the reason, so our total pumping in 2030 was 10,505 acre-feet, and that continued out through the modeling scenario. And imported water, the reason that the water district and Cyrils were able to stop pumping in this scenario is we assumed that imported water for direct use would be available to them so that they could stop pumping. And that would be available through one of the 2 concepts we had developed on imported water. And the concept for the water district in Cyrils is that the water would come from Antelope Valley East Current Water Agency. We also, at the suggestion of the TAC, had a second imported water feature in that modeling scenario, and that was that we had recharge into the basin in the Inyo Kern area from the LA aqueduct, so that we were using both sources of water, imported water in this scenario. So the amount of water used out of storage in this scenario out to the year 2040, or I'm sorry, no, this is out to 2070, was about 250,000 acre-feet. And we estimated that 33 shallow wells would be impacted, and the mitigation cost, if those were all to be re-drilled, would be 2.475 million acre-feet. Then, as Steve had explained at the board meeting, the allocation meetings that had been taking place among the attorneys for the major pumpers in the basin came to an impasse, and we turned to the board to get direction on what the next step should be in our evaluations, and got direction to do modeling scenarios 3, 4, and 5. Modeling scenario 3 was based on how we were able to interpret the white paper that had been put out before. That scenario included continuing the current level of pumping for 10 years, and then having a ramp down over 10 years to the natural yield of the basin, 7,650 acre-feet in the year 2040, and we'd maintain pumping at that out into the future. That modeling scenario assumes that any water needs that weren't met by pumping at 7,650 acre-feet a year or during a ramp-down period would be met through the direct use of imported water. That scenario resulted in a use of water in reserve or a loss of storage, 395,000 acre feet. There were an estimated 72 shallow wells would be impacted, and mitigation costs were estimated at 5.4 million acre feet. Scenario 4 was what was referred to as a water buyout scenario. And this assumed that current pumping would continue until the year 2022.
Stop for a second, Steve. Hey, Pat, can you double check and make sure you're on mute until you speak, please?
I'm so sorry. We do not. We have this. Yes, just a moment.
Thank you.
Okay, just a minute.
Okay, Steve, go ahead. Thank you, Pat.
It's Jeff, but I'll
I'm
get
sorry,
going.
Jeff.
So,
I'm
that's
not
all right.
trainable.
No, you're used to him doing most of the talking. Scenario 4, what was called the water buyout, we'd continue pumping until 2022, and at that time, there were allocations of pumping under this theory of extending the federally reserved right that the Navy would have over the municipal pumping. That portion of the municipal pumping, which we had used a number of 86% of the municipal pumping, would not ramp down, but all of the remaining 14% of their pumping allocation would ramp down, and that all non-municipal pumping that didn't have an extension of the Federal Reserve right would also ramp down over 6 years. And we would ramp those down not to the safe yield of the basin, but to 12,000 acre feet a year, because we were trying to look at what we thought a reasonable amount of water supply was to maintain essentially the quality of the community as it is now. So like 12,000 acre feet largely meet that. And then we bumped it 12,000 acre feet a year after that ramp down. That scenario included recharge beginning in 2035 near Inyo Kern, and we would recharge the difference between the natural yield of the basin, the 7650, and the amount we had ramped the pumping down at 12,000 acre feet. The amount of water used out of storage during that modeling scenario was 214,000 acre feet a year. It's estimated that 31 wells could be impacted, and that the mitigation cost would be $2,325,000. And then the last scenario that we were directed to do at that time, scenario 5, which was called the immediate halt, called for us to continue pumping as we are until 2022, and then in 2022, agricultural and industrial pumping would go to zero, and we'd continue to pump at a level of about 10,019 after 2022, and then we would do recharge near the Inyo Kern area. That used the amount of reserves in the amount of 162,000 acre feet, impacted 13 estimated wells at a cost of $975,000. As I mentioned at the last PAC meeting, after the board considered these results, they had directed us to develop another scenario that, based on some of the considerations in scenario number 4, the water buyout, primarily looking at the amount of water that was removed from storage. That was one of the targets we wanted to try and hit, was using about that amount of storage. They wanted to use the amount of water that was pumped the ramp down, but change that into what was initially called a cliff, and then later evolved into a block of water that could be distributed and have some flexibility in its use by agricultural and industrial uses. So we ran 2 versions of that in scenario 6, scenario 6.1 and 2. We basically gave allocations of pumping to the domestic municipal pumping. Those were very near their current levels of pumping, except for the water district. They're actually currently using less than the allocation method we assumed would provide for them initially. One of the new features in this scenario is that we did provide for some growth, which we hadn't done before. We provided that the water district would grow at 1% a year. So that would eventually take them up to their full allocation and beyond their full allocation. And our pumping at 2040 was 11,252 acre-feet a year, which did grow over time with the growth in the water district's demand. We had imported water that would be recharged at Inyo Kern starting in 2035, and that amount of water that was recharged would increase to match the growth in the water district's demands. We had an increasing imported water use. And the other important feature and the distinguishing feature between this scenario and 6.2 is that we had seen in previous modeling scenarios that after 2040 we continued to lose water out of storage, and that was due to primarily evapotranspiration in the basin. So we tried to offset that evapotranspiration by including an additional 2,500 acre-feet a year of imported water recharge near Inyo Kern to see if that would have the impact of getting the basin better into balance. We also redistributed some of the pumping to try and optimize the pumping in the basin. It had been pointed out in I think specifically in scenario 4 that we still ended up with some areas that had concentrated pumping, primarily in the southwest and southeast, and water levels did continue to decline to some degree there. So we moved some of the pumping from the southwest and the southeast up into the northwest to try and balance pumping in this scenario. This scenario resulted in loss of storage of 126,000 acre-feet, and we have not completed a shallow well impact or an estimate of mitigation costs at this point. As I mentioned, scenario 6.2, the only difference between it and 6.1 is in 6.2 we did not include the water to offset evapotranspiration, the 2,500 acre-feet a year that we had in imported water recharge near Inyo Kern. We did not include that in 6.2. And it resulted in a loss of storage of about 213,500 acre-feet, which was near the target amount from the water buyout scenario, scenario 4. So that's my summary of what's in the table.
Okay, so what we're looking at is across 8 scenarios, including the baseline, which isn't on here, is the varying, and they all have some slightly different criteria that went into feeding them, such as when and how much imported water or other supplementary water comes into play, when pumping starts, stops, the length of it, etc., over the 2020 to 2040 and then 2070 period that was looked at to dampen out all the effects over time. And we're being asked what transpired after looking at scenarios 3, 4, and 5, which were run simultaneously to sort of bracket what the options were in the valley from a total loss of storage standpoint and some other factors for modeling. But after they looked at scenario 0, the baseline, scenario 1 and 2, looked at 3, 4, and 5, and said, oh my goodness, look at the additional damages to shallow wells and the mitigation costs doubling, and said, how do we, that together with all of the uncertainties that were covered during our last meeting on slide number 11 of the scenario 6 presentation, which listed at least five uncertainties that affected or could affect what the reserves are in the basin, including national emergency and several others, accuracy, uncertainty in the model, et cetera. So what the board came up with was the scenario 6.1 and 6.2. We've now combined them, putting them into context with all the other ones that went before us. And yes, there are not apples to apples to apples, but there are some pretty close comparisons that can be understood at a macro level with regards to question A. And we get to how much water should be allocated to the ag industrial pool, which was the pool, 63.8. If that's the way it's aggregated. Is that the right volume? And the question behind this is, in essence, how much mining of the basin should the GA or the valley allow by non-municipal and industrial pumpers? And the memo everybody has in front of them clarify that that equates to the non-domestic pumpers, which was the terminology used in scenario 6, both 6.1 and 6.2. And that number results in about 214 acre-foot as loss of storage. And so if you see in scenario 5, for example, where there was an immediate halt, that was one of the bookends of the scenario. If we all stop pumping today beyond above the reef charge, how much do we lose? And you see the surrogate for damage there and cost was, and these are not exact numbers, they're modeling estimates, 13 wells at a cost of just under $1 million. When you look at scenario 3, which was the other bookend, the white paper, it was called that white paper going back a couple years ago, or a year and a half ago or more. Almost 400,000 acre-foot, and it was looked at that scenario number 3 between those two bookends might be something close to a sweet spot with regards to what the community, the entire community in the valley of all the water users, could stand in terms of damage for continued pumping in the aquifer. And they took that number, tweaked it some, and targeted 6.1 and 6.2, as Jeff well explained. 6.1 being is modified, the recharge or the total acre-foot loss of storage is half because of they added the imported water at 2,500 acre-foot a year at one point to try and get rid of the evapotransport.
Just say
yeah, ET. It's easiest that way, not extraterrestrial. Evapotranspiration. The senior moment. The issue is that enough? If you combine the two issues of what is the damage that the entire valley is going to be charged with or responsible for mitigating additional pumping or less pumping beyond that 63.8, plus a consideration for how much should stay in reserve. So those are two factors that are beneath this question number 1. To continue for the public with question A, recall that the more water mined from the basin results in additional potential domestic impacts to shallow wells that will need to be addressed and mitigated, I just added. That's what I just was trying to explain to everybody. And then the second question, if we think is that about right? Now we're cutting with an axe here. I mean, and I would point out as I mentioned earlier, we have a plan that we're going to submit. The Valley, RGA, is going to submit by January 31st this year, that is required to be submitted at that time, but is fully intended to be updated and, in fact, required to be updated as more data comes available. This plan under 6.1 and 6.2 that we're being asked about does no limitation of pumping for 2 years. It puts no limitation on it. So we have time to continue to get additional data, and that subject was brought up at the last meeting, that with a lot more work around some of the SkyTem modeling and the others, we may know more about the depth of the basin and be able to run these and see if depth has any issue on the, not depth, total storage in the basin, if that has any factor there or not. And that will give us time to do that, to ensure that. So the question we're being asked, A, is this about as much as, and it's a policy question, is this as much as we can tolerate versus the cost to the entire valley, or should it be more or less? That's the question on the floor.
Do you want me to start down here?
Go ahead, Lyle.
Okay. I looked at that 63.8 and thought, well, that's about 2 full years of normal pumping in the valley. Seems to be. I got some feedback. Yeah, I got some feedback. That's about 2 years worth of normal pumping in the valley. You know, of course, I'm not an engineer. I don't know what that, you know, that number is arbitrary as far as I know, and it's a little hard to define. But what that equates to in my wells, what I can equate it to, is about 3 foot going down more. Now,
that's for your well.
That's my well
yeah.
in my area, okay? That whole area goes down about 1.5 feet a year. So therefore, 63,000 acre feet out of the valley is going to bring my well down another 3 feet. Now, if you had another 2 years of grace period in there, now that's 6 feet, and that's 6 feet of lost storage. So, you know, it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard for me to, you know, like I said, that's an arbitrary number. So that's the way I looked at it. So that's my shot.
Thank you.
I asked myself, what's the value of this water? We're talking about, I don't know, $2,000 to $4,000 an acre foot to replace it. Someday in the future, if and when we're able to import water. And I did something which might be regarded as silly, but I asked, what is the value of this water today? If you had to replace that water, how would you replace it? Well, you'd haul water. That is the only option. So I said, well, let me see if I can put on a dollar amount to that. And so I'm going to make some phone calls. Well, where am I going to call? I finally decided to call Wyoming, because between here and Wyoming, they're in overdraft. The Ogallala Aquifer is being drained. So I talked to the gentleman in Metioshki or thereabouts, and what is he charged to haul water? And it turns out we went through the numbers and did the spreadsheet, and he hauls about 5,400 gallons per load. He charges per mile. The cost per acre foot would be about $282,000.
Say that again.
$282,000 per acre foot.
$282,000.
That would be 60 truckloads of 5,400 gallons per load from Wyoming. Then he let me know that Wyoming will not let that water leave the state. Yeah. So let me try calling somewhere closer. So this morning I contacted a water hauler in Acton, and I talked to this lady, and they just deliver locally. They will not deliver to Ridgecrest, but I told her that's not the purpose of my question. They charge $150 an hour. The water is free for their customers. If you assume 50 miles an hour average speed, it's going to cost you $600 per load to drive it about 200 miles round trip. They haul about 4,000 gallons a load. So their cost per acre foot is only $48,877. If you priced out the value of the block of water that's being offered, 63,836 acre feet, that's $3 billion $120,000. So there is a piece of perspective on what that water is worth to this valley right now. Another observation where there's a lot of concern about what fraction of the groundwater storage this is. I need to remind everybody we're really interested in the potable groundwater storage. And as we know, all the pumping that's been going on in this valley for many decades, we don't pump where the water's bad. We pump where the water's good. So there's probably a bias towards depleting the potable groundwater, and there is certainly risk when we assume any amount of groundwater in storage. So my conclusion, this is a very generous offer. It's effectively an offer of a buyout to agriculture, in my mind. I think it's a very generous offer. When you look at the real today's dollar values of that water, and it should also be remembered that they would be getting away risk-free in this. You know, the danger of the potable groundwater being largely extinguished would be passed on to those who remain behind. And I think so. I would suggest that this is a generous offer. I guess I can endorse it, but if it looks like there's going to be litigation, drop the offer. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I tried a hard time getting my hands around this also, but I used, Lyle, an approach somewhat similar to yours. You looked at total pumping, and I looked at the 63,000 in relation to natural recharge. And when you divide that out, it equates to 8.3 years of taking all of the natural recharge. The significance of that, I don't know. It's just a number. It's a division, but it seems like a lot to me. Like West, I can live with it. There's risks, there's gambles associated with that, and in agreeing that that seems like a reasonable amount, I would hope that there could be a footnote that says that if we get in trouble with our minimum thresholds, there would be a sharing of some sort of reduction, throughout the system. But overall, the 63 feels reasonable to me, but there are risks, and there are more than those that I think West has raised. Thank you.
Other PAC member comments? And I wasn't ignoring the right side. Okay, Judy?
First of all, I read the list of tasks that we were assigned to do, and I took each part and answered each part of each question, because each part has multiple questions. I don't know where you want me to start. I feel that...
Yeah, just start with, the first part of A is what we're talking about right now.
The first part of A says how much water should be allocated to the ag industrial pool. First off, Searles Valley Minerals has been pumping water from this valley since the 1920s or the 1930s. I believe they have a historical right to their water, and I think they should be separated out from agriculture. They're a separate category unto themselves.
Okay, and second part? Well, it's all part of the first part because it still is 62,826 the right amount. Your next item.
Yes.
I'm following your written sheet.
Yes. I think this is technical. This is a technical question that needs to be addressed, not a policy question. It needs to be looked at in the term of its drawdown effects over time. It involves the cumulative impact of concentrated pumping in specific areas. And it should be looked at not only for lowering of water levels, but for lowering of water quality. This also includes not just agriculture, but the Indian Wells Valley Water District and the Navy. They should be looked at as to where they are pumping and the effects it causes on shallow wells. Do you want me to go on?
Yeah, number 3 is also a part of the first question. And then when you go to 4, that's the next question. So just go to do your 3 next.
Number 3 says, how much mining of the basin should be allowed by non-M&I pumpers? In order to answer this question, the technical question of how much potable water is in storage needs to be addressed. The water estimates in storage by various authorities also includes non-potable water, which was unknown at the time. Those are the ones listed on the sheet we were given. Studies indicate that we have already used well over half of our water in storage. Therefore, we need to reduce pumping a great deal over a fairly short period of time, even before we receive imported water. The shallow well impact study will provide key feedback, but it is not yet available for us to look at.
Okay, thank you, Judy. That's the ones that address this portion of the question. And the way I want to proceed on this, in order to make the most effective use of our time, and we must be done no later than 4:30 because they have a city council meeting they need to set up for, is that we'll do member comments as we're doing right now on each one of these sub-questions in order, and then we'll allow public comment, and then we'll go to the next question.
Well, I have one more thing to add that isn't written there. It is crucial for us, not only for the sake of litigation versus non-litigation, but it is crucial for the future of this valley with our water supply to make decisions that are based on sound science. And as I state earlier and later in my paper, there hasn't been an open discussion by the TAC of the pros and cons of these various scenarios. Thank you.
Thanks,
Can
Judy.
I have, David, may I have a follow-up? I'd just like to agree with Judy on one point she made earlier on that Searles Valley Minerals should be removed from the ag because they have a historical right that goes way back in the 20, whatever it is. So that to me is kind of like a no-brainer, I think. They should not be lumped together. That's all.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons they're not is that they're pumping from this basin into another basin. But that is a legal question. That is not our purview today. Our input, as you and Judy have given, will be forwarded. Other PAC member comments?
Okay, for Searles Valley Minerals, as far as agreeing to the 63,836, we think that is an unacceptable number. I also think that that's a number that the TAC probably should have input on more than the policy group, because it's a technical number based on storage values that I'm not sure we actually have a decent number from. I've heard all sorts of different storage values, numbers, and the uncertainty in all of them is quite high. So we do not agree with the 63,836, although we do not give a particular number that we're wedded to. I want to remind everyone that we do have 1,213 acre feet a year that we're claiming as historic, so keep that in mind also. As far as the mining of the basin, again, that's a technical question because it should be linked to the water levels, and I'm unclear as to how that is done in scenario 6. So I don't want to get into a technical discussion of water levels. And lastly, dust mitigation. Did you want to cover that now?
Now, that's the next one. We'll do this one first. Right now, we're addressing, is this about the right number or not, and why we agree, disagree, higher, lower, or the issues you and others have brought up.
Right. So you cannot make a determination of whether or not mining from the reserve is too much or not enough if you don't know how much your reserve is. So I'd like to see more work on that.
Okay, thank you, Camille. Ed, you deferred to the lady, so your turn.
Well, I have a couple comments about the whole idea of agriculture getting ramped down to zero. I don't feel that that's the spirit of Sigma, and that we were supposed to, stakeholders come together and work out a plan, which I think is still viable, but this scenario 6, that both the different two scenarios are still the only management action I see is getting rid of agriculture. And the terminology mining only applies to agriculture and not to domestic and city use. It's all the same. It's still drawing from the basin. And I think working together, we can come up with a science-based plan, not just an arbitrary decision to get rid of agriculture.
Thanks, Ed. Tim?
This is a policy committee, and one of the policies I think that makes the most sense is that we support a diverse economy in our valley. And, we have some, very large interests in the valley. And if we start lopping off, we can't afford to have agriculture, and then say the base funding goes down, we may have extra water, but we don't have a diverse economy. So from a policy standpoint, I think a diverse economy should be part of the priority for making our decisions. And so, therefore, I don't think that you can put a number on this. I think we have to find a way to meet our needs, not just now, but and with conservation, but also into the future, as if we expect this valley to grow.
Thanks, Tim. Other comments from my left, not the left.
I just have a question about the historical amount for Cyril's Family Mineral. Could you please repeat it, Camille?
It should be with the paper that came from the lawyer. It's 1,213 that we can prove acre feet a year before the Navy came. It, obviously fluctuates and stuff, so.
Did you have other comments, Renee?
My only comment is the only other scenario, I would need more data. I concur with Judy Decker that we need more scientific analysis of that 63,836 acre feet. I see that the only other thing to compare it to where you would use less than that would be scenario number 5. That's my comment.
Which was the bookend that got the unfortunate nickname nuclear option.
Yeah, immediate halt. That to me right now, from the data we've been given and what I've read and gone to the meetings, is the only other option to get significantly different than the 63,836, where you would actually be mining less from the water basin. A lot less.
Okay, Josh?
I just wanted to clarify a couple things. So on scenarios 6.1 and 6.2, those start in 2020, correct? Those start
6.1 and 6.2 start upon submission on January 31st of 2020 is my understanding.
Okay.
But there's no pumping reductions for 2 years after that date, for the first 2 years.
I don't think that's.
Is that correct, Jeff?
That's not correct, I don't think.
That's not totally correct, David. Starting as soon as the plan is adopted in the modeling run, pumpers that don't have a continuous history of pumping, or that we don't have information on a continuous history of pumping, between 2010 and 2014, they stop pumping immediately.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Go ahead. I'm sorry, continue.
Okay. But in addition, the block of water is distributing starting at that time also. So, you know, the water available to the ag interests and cereals, it becomes available at that time when they start using it. And I'm going to beat Josh to the punch. Our estimate of how long the block for Mojave would last would be 8 months. Now, in the modeling scenario, we assume they would continue to pump through the lease market, but I'm certain that's a clarification he'd want made.
Okay, thank you very much for making that. I had two different things mixed up in my mind. My apology.
So that's why I was just wanting to point out on the table 1 and table 2, when you see where it says 3 months and 8 months of pumping for Mojave pistachios, that starts in February. So that'd be February, March, and April. We're out of water in one plan, and then 8 months. So basically, we would barely get through to harvest, and we'd be out of water in our first year. And I understand that there's a lease market, but I'm just talking about our allocated amount of water. Another just comment, when you're looking at the difference between model scenario 6.1 and 6.2, is it's about 90,000 acre-feet difference in loss of storage, and I believe that is the evapotranspiration on the playa, whether that's replaced or not by imported water. And I would just point out that 90,000 acre-feet is 150% of the amount that's being allocated to ag and industry. And then I'll have some comments at the end, and we'll reserve the right to make probably some more official comments at the GA board meeting next week.
Thank you, Josh. Pat, do you have comments? You are free to make comments. You just can't vote, if we vote.
Yeah, I don't, I'm listening to everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, and you provided written comments that were passed out to all PAC members.
Right. I didn't have a comment on the specific amount because I wasn't positive at the time that I wrote that where that amount came from or if it might change. And so I just chose not to make a big deal out of it. I do understand that there has to be, some changes made. And for that, yes, if we have to do whatever it takes. I'm not clear on why Searles Valley thinks it has a lot of rights. I mean, I do understand everything they say and all the historic use and all of that. But all during that time, they've had access to water in a county, not their county. And I want to know when, going into the future, when there is a lack of water, say, for example, farms are gone, what is San Bernardino County going to do to help put water back in Kern County to supplement what they take? I'm just not, are they going to help pay for it? What is the deal here? Or do they get a free hand where they can just continue to do whatever they want and, it doesn't matter? So that I'd like to see that cleared up between the two counties. And I have to say that I think when you take farms out of the equation, on one hand I understand why. On the other, I don't understand how that is that a city can have rampant growth, but you don't want farms. And you don't have any water plan for the rampant growth in the city. So that is, an area I'd also like to see covered. If you're going to take away farm water, okay, if you have to, but why do you have no plan for how you're going to provide water to the city, or how is the city going to provide its own water, or have mitigation, or any of those things? It seems that's how it got us, that's how we got into this problem, was to have no plan. So I'd like to see that covered. As far as how much you allocate to each farm, to be determined on that. It looks, for the smaller agricultural entities, the family-run, home-run farms, such as mine and Hovaton and Hickle and Conaway, we're probably better off with the acreage, option and take what we can get. But I have a lot of questions about things like, why is water allowed on the playa, but, and it evaporates away. What is special about the playa that has to have all that water go there? Is there a way to stop that from happening and use that water somehow before it gets there? I don't know. Nobody's ever said anything about that. So I'd like to see some of these things covered. I don't know if they can be or when they will be, but I would like to see it happen. And I think it's a shame to take state-of-the-art farms out of business. I just want to say that.
I would like to add something to what Pat said. And I realize that we're talking about scenarios, what-if situations. But there's a lot of detail that has gone into it, and a lot of words have been written down. And yet, the issue of water rights has not yet been addressed. And every person that owns a piece of land in this valley and has a well on it and uses that water on that land has an overlying right. And I think that is the big concern, Pat, that you have. And I think it's justifiable. Because it has been left out of all of this.
One concern, for sure. How can I say it's not a concern? Because it certainly is. But we live where we live, and we're trying to solve a problem. And, I'd like to be part of the solution. I just don't want to be, I don't want to be foolish in the process.
Thank you, Pat.
I appreciate what you said, Judy. I think it's important.
Okay, thank you, Pat.
You're welcome.
And reminder, go back on mute. Thanks.
Will do.
Okay.
I have a comment as far as the initial allocations. The numbers that you were talking about for scenario 6, that starts out with the allocation equal to the lowest annual pumping between 2010 and the end of 2014. So that's not actual current pumping.
Right.
I just wanted to clarify.
Thank you. John, Lorelei, Don, comments?
Yeah, recognizing the economic impact that cutting everybody off day one would have, I think, that we understand that's not realistic. So the question whether that 63,000, whatever that number is reasonable, I kind of take the same approach that Lyle talked about. When you consider that that's probably a little bit more than 2 years of what we're currently pumping, and the impact that has on the aquifer well levels. I mean, for decades, we've averaged about 1 foot to 1.5 foot across the basin, and not minimizing the fact that, it could be substantially more in certain areas, but I think we can get a good idea of looking at the loss of storage from scenarios 6.1 and 6.2 of what that impact might be on shallow wells. But I think that I think we do have to have some sort of a pool of water, as it's called, to allow us time to look at this a little closer and get our plan in place. So is that number reasonable in terms of historical average and drop to well levels? I think it is. Again, I don't want to minimize the fact that it may affect some shallow wells in the basin, but I think it's a reasonable number. And I do want to clarify the statement I made at the PAC meeting August 1st with regard to the storage number. I believe I stated it, but I want to clarify again that I wasn't questioning the methodology that Stetson is using. The numbers that they're using for water for storage in the basin are numbers that come from studies that were done, previously. Could there be a better number developed? I think there could be, because we've had more advancements in technology and there are better tools available. But I think that we need to go with this number now. And as I think you stated earlier, David, that once we have an opportunity to look at this number a little closer, and should that number change anything significantly, that the board can certainly take that into consideration and make any adjustments they need to make with those results. So with regard to the number, I think it's reasonable.
Okay, thank you, Don. Any other committee comment before we open to the public?
I'd like to make another general comment. When this started, part of the problem was ag was using, in the Central Valley, was using 80% of the water, and commercial interest cities and whatnot were using like 20%. And part of the motivation of Sigma was to move some of the ag water to the cities. We have some similarities to the general problem, but it's much different to think of taking all of the ag water, cutting them off, and then solving our problem for today. But in the long term, it leaves us without a diverse economy.
Thanks, Tim. Let me make a comment. I'm the chair, and in order to execute that role, I have to be neutral with regards to the way we handle our business and the way I represent this committee and the way we report at the GA and speak with one voice, which we don't have one voice. So I am charged with representing the widely different interests that are on this board that are graphically visible in this issue. In my position that I was assigned to this board, I represent business interests, and that's primarily the Navy and the industries related to the Navy, which turns out to be roughly, it's well over 80% of the economic value in the community. And I've said this before, there are members, we're getting flicker vertigo again, Gary, from our monitors. There are members, there are folks that work for the Navy or work for companies that support the Navy, or service folks that we all use that fit every interest on this dais up here, every one of us. So I have a responsibility to represent a broad group as well, but my focus and interest are those things that revolve around preserving the largest number of folks. And I recognize we have a couple things that are different in this basin. It is a closed basin. Our sole source of water is groundwater. We don't have access to California State Water Project water that they have in the valley. We don't have access to delivery mechanisms. Now, we're looking at that through the Imported Water Committee, and from my working with them in my job as advocacy, we still have more meetings scheduled, and from the ones that I have had at very senior levels, just my opinion, this is not there in the Imported Water Committee report. I think we have real opportunity there. But right now, our only sustenance for all of us in this valley is the water we are taking out of the ground. And we've been taking it out of the ground in excess of what our currently estimated recharge rate is since the 60s. So what the GA is charged with by January is coming with their first cut plan in writing on how to deal with that. And we're looking at large users that have invested in this, that also produce some of our food, et cetera, on one hand, and on the other hand, we're looking at can you follow houses? Can you follow homes? And they're looking at the amount we're pumping right now, roughly 3 times what our recharge is, without imported water or brackish or any of the other options for supplemental water. And in the near term, that's the challenge that they face. And they looked at a way to mitigate, and this is my observation, how do we get back some of the investment that ag has made to get to a more equitable distribution? And with regards to question A, as I look at the results, the technical results we have to date, just from the shallow well mitigation plan, when I looked at scenarios 3, 4, and 5, I said that's probably about as much as the valley can take. Now, that is not necessarily the distribution between ag and everybody, but I don't think we can risk going below that, both with regards to shallow well mitigation and the other unknowns, which include what we know the base could use in a high and others would need in an emergency, and I mean wartime emergency, and I'm aware of some of the things that are planned for this base in that circumstance. So my feeling is that that's probably about the right number, and where that is taken with regards to ag or not, that's a second question to me. And in this scenario that was run this way, it was taken from ag. And this gets at the beneficial use issue, and there are a lot more legal issues in there, like water rights, as Judy brought up, and others. But I think this is about the right number for a floor we want to set on how much more damage do we want to cause to the basin and have to pay for, all of us, not just ag. So that's my sense. Now, when we get into how this 63.8 is adjudicated, should ag be the major portion of that? Probably, because of what we have talked about here. But that's just my sense for what I represent.
I have a comment.
Lorelei, raise your hand first.
I'm sorry. Can I go? That's okay. Absolutely.
Lorelei Oviatt, Kern County Planning Director. I'm on this advisory committee as a planner. It does say Kern County on there. I want to be clear that my comments are representing Kern County, the following comments. I know that this is a very, very difficult issue, but I want to remind everyone that you cannot ignore and make revisionist history. The County of Kern spent over $500,000 doing an environmental impact report, and the Kern County Board of Supervisors took a position that agriculture was not a land use that was appropriate for this valley. The inference should not be made that the existing farms were left because of a diversified economy. That finding was not made, or that there was somehow those farms should exist forever. That was not the finding of the Kern County Board of Supervisors, who has land use. The Kern County Board makes land use decisions all the time, all over the county, about what's appropriate. We could make $50, $60 million off of wind turbines, but we have made the determination that an entire area of eastern Kern cannot have wind turbines because military installation airspace was more important. That is just an example of how decision makers decide that some land uses are more important than other land uses. It is an unfortunate part of our built environment that we have to make choices. The determination to leave this zoning of existing was to allow for this very process, and that was done in 2014-15. We are now in 2019 to provide time for those property owners to determine perhaps there's other things they want to do with their property. There are other things you can do in the A zone besides crops. It's a very, very long list of what you can do in the agricultural zoning. No one has chose to do that. That's their choice. But I don't want revisionist history to suddenly show up in the PAC minutes that somehow the Kern County Board of Supervisors took a position that ag was a use in this particular valley, and it was all related to water. So I think that needs to, these are very, very difficult, decisions, but sometimes you have to make business decisions to change how you do business over a long period of time, and I think that is what the PAC is being asked to do. What is the time period by which people can make appropriate business decisions to amortize their cost? And how do you allocate? How do we allocate on acreage, on pumping? Does a small farmer have less ability to amortize? I think those are all important questions. But to say that ag is something that should forever live in this valley is not a policy decision that the board has stood behind. Thank you.
Thanks for that clarification, Lorelei. I don't think anybody said that Kern County supervisors had taken a position other than that. It was an individually expressed opinion about. It's good. It's a good reminder, and I had forgotten that. And when they did that, thank you for bringing that history to light. Okay,
I have a
Judy?
comment. As the representative chosen from the Eastern Kern County Resource Conservation District, I do represent everyone who has property in this valley. I represent the guy that lives on the corner of Norma and Drummond in a little tiny house, and I represent small and big ag and the private, shallow domestic well owner, of which I am one. My point of view and concern is the future water supply and how we are going to deal with it so that it can last as long as possible until we get supplemental water. I know for a fact, having served on the Indian Wells Valley Water District and been involved in the Bureau of Reclamation study, that all of the monitoring wells that were drilled for that project, as well as other wells drilled by the Water District at that time, 1992-93, the deeper the driller went, the more saline the water, the tighter the formation of the ground it was coming from, which means it's going to take a lot more electricity to get the water in the first place. That was true with Beer Rec Well 1, which is in the very southwest part of the Indian Wells Valley. And it was true for Beer Rec Well 10, which is up at the old sawmill site by 9 Mile Canyon Road. That is my concern. I will do my best to represent all of the different water users as well as I can do. And I just wanted to put that out there. And I would like to note that David is one of the few people who, when we say the Pledge of Allegiance, says to our republic. I'm a very strong believer in the rights that we have been given as citizens by our Constitution, and water rights is one of them.
Thank you, Judy. Okay, with that, before we go to the public, one last question one last comment from Board Member Pack.
Yeah, I've had some thoughts about the economic impact, and of course, of concern are all the investments in infrastructure, not only agriculture's, in everybody's home, in the Navy, Searles Valley. Also of concern are the livelihoods, the jobs, people's homes. Sigma says that you should consider uses and users when addressing this situation. And I think since we do have this prescriptive tangle that Mr. Markman talked about, it makes sense in my mind to prioritize uses. And you might prioritize uses based on how much infrastructure is dependent upon that use continuing, how many livelihoods are dependent upon that use continuing. And that way you could put all investments in infrastructure on a level playing field, and you could compare the irrigation that's done by the homeowner to the irrigation that's done in agriculture. So my suggestion would be to have a hierarchy of uses, prioritize those uses based on their economic value or their benefit to the valley, and then you can spread those uses in a matrix across users, and that will tell you whether agriculture, whether it's infrastructure, how it compares to all the other investments. It will tell you how many jobs it creates compared to the other jobs in the basin. So that would be my suggestion to the Groundwater Authority: prioritize uses, examine the economic value of all uses, and that should help you then allocate those uses across users.
Okay, with that, let's open it to public comment on this one narrow piece of the topic. We'll go to the next one in a moment, which is a portion of this for mitigation shallow well impacts. I'm sorry, ecological.
I'm Don Decker. I have some comments in regard to the water and storage and the historic data that we do have. Is that noise coming from here?
I think that was Jeff.
Nope, that wasn't me.
You can't fool us.
The storage numbers that Stetson engineers pulled from the fairly recent literature have numbers that are around 2 million acre feet in the top 200 feet of the aquifer. Those numbers, at the time they were done, had some accounting for the pore water that's also in storage in this basin, but especially the earlier numbers did not have full understanding of the pore water and its volume. And that includes actually the Bureau of Reclamation study that I was a part of. The pore water area under Brown Road, North Brown Road, was not taken into account in that, 2,300 roughly. So when one uses a number that's about 2 million acre feet, I think that's is a reasonable number, if you will, but it's not particularly conservative. That's my message to you. There is a method, and it's easy to implement, and lots of us have done it, and I won't go into it any detail here, but we have 40-some years of experience in dewatering this basin, and it is fairly easy to take the water usage that's been posted year by year, and we know what the groundwater levels have done, and you can calculate the number of acre feet per, say, foot of dewatering that we've actually experienced. So all you have to do is then subtract off something for the actual recharge, and you will have groundwater and storage obtained by actual observation. Thank you.
Thank you, Don.
Hi, Doreen Conaway Baker from Sierra Shadows Ranch. I just had two questions. One on mitigation costs. Did anybody consider what it would take for connecting the outer areas, Brown Road, Inyakern, to city water, to where that way people have the opportunity. You could even do it with water and sewer. That way, water department can, bring it to a main road, and it's the homeowner's job to bring it to their place. And now you've got more clients, and we've just eliminated 72 shallow wells. And then second of all, I was curious on, I understand all of the scenarios and what we are tasked to do. I also am willing to participate or want to help solve the problem and be part of the solution. But I don't think the solution is we have a plan that has to be submitted by 2020, but that plan does not state that we have to enforce some kind of proposed scenario to start on 2020. It could be to start in 2025. That way you have 5 years to work on your uncertainties, on the impacts, and continuing to get the information that we need on all of the wells that aren't registered. And then it just, yes, it brings it out an extra 5 years, but you're still within time to everybody would be completely shut off ag-wise before you would still have 15 years to work on it. So it can be, you could submit your plan without actually stating that this has to start on, February 1st of 2020. In your plan, it could say this is going to start January 1st of 2025. Thank you.
Thank you, Doreen.
Hello, good afternoon, PAC members. Derek Hoffman, attorney for Meadowbrook, and I do have a few comments. As was mentioned before, I did submit a letter to each of you, and I appreciate you reviewing that and considering it. And so my objective now is just to highlight a few of the key points in the letter for your consideration. The first is Meadowbrook. Meadowbrook is one of the largest long-standing producers in the basin, as you know. And so one of the key points in our letter is that Meadowbrook ought to have a permanent allocation for various reasons, as detailed in the letter. I also noted in the letter about the premise that only agriculture is mining the basin. I think that's a faulty premise. I think that Model Scenario 6 appears to say that all the domestic users and the Navy are not mining the basin, but the non-domestic users are mining the basin and therefore need to go away. I would offer an analogy that when all you have is a hammer, everything seems like a nail. And it seems to be that getting rid of agriculture is the primary objective of Model Scenario 6, and so we, of course, object to that. I agree with Judy Decker and others who commented that what you're asked to do today is consider what are really technical and legal questions. They're not direct policy issues. There are a lot of questions that I've raised and others have raised about the assumptions in Model Scenario 6. And as you all may recall, about just last week, I was up here asking that the assumptions underlying Model Scenario 6 be detailed and be explained and be provided to you all so that you can evaluate what Scenario 6 really means. And I'll give one example that's mentioned in my letter, which was I came up and asked what was meant by the optimization of location of pumping. And when I asked, it became clear that what was meant by that was that the water district would come to North Brown Road and not drill a new well, but actually use existing wells. That's what I understood the answer to be. And so that to me suggests that existing wells will be taken and utilized to allow the water district to produce groundwater probably in the exact same amounts or so that existing users are producing. And if that's not accurate, I'd like to hear that. I'd like to understand it. The point is, all of the assumptions ought to be provided for model scenario 6, not just a handful of examples. I'd also note that on the subject of technical issues, SGMA requires that you utilize the best available science and information. It's not sufficient to use just good science. You have to utilize the best information in science. And so if the primary concern of the authority is loss of groundwater storage, and if that's the primary basis for model scenario 6, then I would suggest that you ought to have a clear understanding, or as clear as you can get, about how much water and usable water is in storage, if that's going to be the primary basis for scenario 6 or the GSP. And so, again, though, this process appears to be more ends-driven, and the end seems to be eliminating agriculture from the basin. And I say that because we've not even had a discussion at the PAC, a really significant discussion, or at the board about sustainable management criteria. In fact, if you noticed, that discussion is really just getting started. And yet you're being asked to consider whether a particular number is a good number or a bad number. But what SGMA calls for is establishing sustainable management criteria. And I cited in my letter the best management practice of DWR, cited some of the regulatory requirements, not only for what sustainable management criteria are, but also the process by which you develop those. And I'm suggesting to you that the process that you've been presented with is not consistent with what SGMA calls for in how you go about establishing minimum thresholds, measurable objectives. So I would also mention that if you're willing to support scenario 6 today, then I think taking that position reveals a lack of credibility. And the reason I say that is you don't fully understand it, and I think we all need to understand it before we can really evaluate it, both from a technical and a legal perspective. And so with that in mind, you'll notice that I did offer in my letter a few suggestions for modifications to scenario 6 that should be considered, a few constructive ideas that we hope the board will consider. And again, I just want to reiterate that, like Eddie had mentioned, we're hopeful that a consensus-based GSP can be achieved. And we know that the time is of the essence, but we also don't have time to pursue poor policy or uninformed policy in making the GSP. And so we'll reserve the right to comment further as we hope further discussion ensues. But again, I appreciate you hearing my comments today and taking them under consideration. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Don.
Derek, could you clarify something in your letter, please? You just referred to your suggested modifications to model scenario 6.
Okay.
The second bullet point, the first sentence, incorporate permanent allocations to most non-domestic group members, specifically including Meadowbrook. Who would not be included in that, according to that sentence?
Well, to answer your question, Don, I think that's part of the ongoing discussion that needs to be had. And part of the reason I say that is I understand it, the Groundwater Authority still lacks information about the groundwater production for many of those entities. And so it's not clear to me because I don't have that information. And I think it's a data gap that needs to be filled. And I think that's probably partly why you've proposed an updated groundwater registration well ordinance. So I think that's part of the question about, and it's an information gap, I think, that needs to be filled before we can really think about answering the question you just asked me.
Thank you, Derek.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name's Elaine Mead. I don't pity any of you for having the position you do. With that being said, I would suggest that as you debate this and try to go through it, that you think about the unintended consequences of your actions, not just the board's, because your actions is going to partially direct the board. So when you're sitting there, and I have to agree with some of the comments about ag getting the axe, that is what's happening. And I don't think it's the right way to do it, but That seems to be the direction that you're being given. So think about the unintended consequences as you move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine.
Pat Ferris. Good afternoon. I concur with concerns about agriculture being targeted. And Lorelei, as you recall, when this first came up, before the land use plan was put in place, some of the supervisors had difficulty with the approach from our side, our supervisor, of targeting agriculture. But after 2 or 3 rounds, it turned out that the Todd report was put in place and accepted as the guide for the direction that we're still taking today. Having had a discussion with Dr. Iris Priesthoff, who's the president of the Todd Engineers firm, she said, and I have this in print from her, I was surprised at how much weight was put on our report, because she said they were just reports. She said more studies need to be done. And the difficulty I have had from the beginning of this, my professional job is information. I have a lot of difficulty, as do a lot of people, with setting the course of our future based on an assumption. It is not a proven fact that we are a closed basin. It's not a proven fact that we were on critical overdraft. In fact, we were reclassified after the Todd report was done as critical. Prior to that, we were classified as just overdrafted. I have a lot of difficulty with politically driven approaches as a solution to a problem. I think we hear a lot of terms like unknowns, data gaps, how much water do we really have in storage? These are all unknowns, and I'm not willing to accept charting our course based on a lot of assumptions. This is a scientific community. We should not, I remember how Admiral Corey said this, and I was so impressed by it. He said, we challenge every assumption. We should be challenging the assumptions, not accepting them as our course of action. And I remember, and this is not a personal thing, I've told and said many times, I'm not against anybody. This is for all of us. This situation is bigger than we are. My great-grandchildren that are already born in this community will be living with the decisions we make today. I have a lot of them. And they stayed here because they've chosen to bring up their families here. They believe in this, and they're invested every day in this community. And so for that's another reason I feel so concerned about this, is I'm back to we're a scientific community. We should be basing, I think it was maybe Derek just mentioned a moment ago about Sigma saying best science and information available is what we should be looking at to define our problem. And I know this train's gone way down the track based on the assumption. but it still does not mean that it's the best approach. We could be digging some deep wells. We could be proving our source. If we're concerned about solutions, let's find out how much water, after 50 years of controversy, and I've lived through them, written millions of words about them, 50 years of controversy, and 100 years of studies. It's time for the scientific community to say, let's find out. It is going to cost money, but you think we're not paying a lot of money for the route we're taking here? Costing a lot of money, and it might be all wasted. This might be an exercise in futility, and Lorelei, I said this to you years ago, we may be trying to solve a problem we don't have. Let's find out what our problem is. Let's find a way to get money, and I think Kevin McCarthy will help us get money to dig some deep wells, prove our source, and find out about how much water might be coming in. And as Tim Parker frequently mentions, we don't know how much water's up there. With all the research that's being done about water storage, stored in faults, and we just don't know. Let's find out. We're a scientific community. We should not be settling for anything less than facts.
Thank you, Pat.
Yes, Larry Mead. I used to be a property owner in the valley, and we tried to do conversions of use on real estate, and the only option we could ever see was solar. And solar is a very major project, as Lorelei knows, to get a transportation system. So I guess if I was a farmer today and I was pumping water, I'd like to know from Kern County what my options were for that land use out there. Because I have land out there today that I can't give away. I mean, you can't even get anybody to go look at the stuff. So I'd be really interested of what the county has in mind that could be done with that real estate.
Thank you, Larry.
Claudia Ethan from Simmons Farm. My concern today is a personal one. If you'll notice on one of these draft non-domestic group pumper sheets, they have the farms, all the ag people listed, and our name isn't on there. And I've been informed that the reason our name is not on there is because we had 2 years that we did not pump from 2010 to 2014. We started in 2012. However, we did buy a ranch that was developed way back in the 50s, 60s. Dick Lewis was the owner, and I know that he had an irrigation well on that property and so on, and raised cattle. And I know we had a lot of corrals and things to clean up. Our personal situation is that we spent, of course, a lot of money to fix that place up. We started pumping in 2012, like I said. So because of that, we are not given an allotment at all. So we won't even, obviously, if this goes through, we won't even have the opportunity to get a few months' worth of pumping like the rest of the people. So, I have heard from the powers that be that this particular time period of 2010 through 2014, it's an arbitrary time frame. I guess it was selected, who knows, by the people in Sacramento. But I was informed that it doesn't have to be used. The board can come up with their own whatever. Maybe not a time frame, but if we were working together and trying to work with individual needs, it doesn't have to be used. The board can make that decision. And so my thought today was that I would appreciate it, since you represent us, to speak to the board about possibly not using that time frame. There's only about, as I know, 3 or 4 farmers that fit into this category. And since we only have 11 farmers, it's not like we have 110 or 1,010 or whatever it is. We have a very few number of people. It seems like we could work with us, and we could all get together and try to figure something out so that it's not such a choking method. Because I mean, if we don't, we're going to be cut off. So, and I have financing that has to be paid off in 2023. I don't know how we're going to do it. I guess we'll have to file bankruptcy. I mean, and I've never done that. I don't want to do that. But it's just disheartening that this has come so quickly, and it's like, hey, you're done. And then what does it do to the land values? We have agricultural zoning now. We were able to maintain that, but we will have no water. So I'm afraid, it's pennies on the dollar. So I don't know. It's just tough because personally, this is our retirement, and I don't know where we're going to go from here. But I just would appreciate it I appreciate that you listened. But if we could change that time frame, it might solve some problems. We're paying the fee, for what? We were good enough to pay the fee. We're not good enough to have the water allocation. So I know you have lots to think about, but that's my take on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia.
Good afternoon, gentlemen, ladies. I'm one of those evil family farms out in Indian Kern, Frank Bellino.
Can you get a little closer to the mic? We're being
Sure,
recorded,
whatever you
please.
need.
Thanks.
That good enough? Okay, thanks, Dave. First of all, Laura, you made a statement that there's some other commercial uses for the property other than farming. That's just a rubric to get around the issue of taking versus confiscation in the Fifth Amendment. You know that regulatory taxing us out of existence, you don't have to buy us out. Now, I am not emotionally attached to my trees and my orchard. I am emotionally attached to 30 years of blood, sweat, and tears. I'm a one-man band. I fix everything. I do all the work. It's me and a couple of part-time workers, usually the 18, 19-year-olds on the swim and wrestling teams at Burroughs or something like that. There's no other commercial use for my property. It's weeds. It's tumbleweeds. So that's a rubric. That's nonsense. The second issue is, shortly after the earthquake, it was announced that Kevin McCarthy had gone and spoke with President Trump and gotten $100 million of immediate work to fix China Lake. I understand that. There's a lot of infrastructure there that's damaged. The DOD has a vested interest in this. Has the DOD and Representative McCarthy been approached to include a line item to buy those 11, or you said it was 11 or 12, 13 farmers? To buy the 11 that are allocated, and those who fall into her group that are unfortunate because you've got your family fortunes wrapped up in it. I've got well over $2 million in my farm. I started out as an indentured servant with a truck and a rake and a son. And now we're 15 acres, and we had planned on expanding to the 40, but that's not going to happen. I'll walk away in a heartbeat. You write me a check. But if you're going to try to tax me out of existence, I'm going to fight you tooth and nail. And I will gladly give to all the other farmers to hire whoever we got to fight this in litigation, because this is atrocious. You're putting the whole blame. And if you cut out ag altogether, how much of your overdraft still exists? Seriously, how much overdraft still exists? It's about half or more. If there is an overdraft, I agree that I'm not sure that the data that's out there yet really supports a conclusion one way or the other than the fact my well now, in 1991, it was at 181 feet. 3 months ago, when I had to have my well down for a couple of months to do some repairs, it was at 201. So I've lost 10, I think it's 10 feet in 25 years. So I'm not really I'm not concerned that much. I don't see that rate that other people see, but it's there. So all I'm saying is that if you want to take our livelihood away, that's okay. Just show me the money. And I don't think any other farmer out here is that emotionally attached to their work. I know Mr. Quist has put time and 30 years into his effort, along with the Conaways or my neighbors just down the street. They have far more invested than I do. And it's got to be breaking their hearts. And emotions had nothing to do with it. It's cold, hard cash. And you know what? We've put a lot out, and you want to just take it? Not without a fight. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other member of the public want to speak before Larry speaks a second time? Okay, go ahead.
Just another tidbit of information. Last week, Dave, you said something about watering properties and stuff for dust control. And I just want you all to think about what 3,000 plus acres of blowing sand is going to create. And Lorelei has first-hand experience with this and can tell. I think we need to really give this some serious thought. This is a policy, and that's what you guys are up here for. You better be very, very careful, because you talk about damage in the Navy. You want to shut down those airfields with 3,000 acres of blowing sand? Just a thought.
Thanks, Larry. Okay. Thought we had a deal, Don. Oh, you're speaking for the second time.
We did have a deal. I want to point out something here. I think we all have sympathy, really, for the folks that are likely to be experiencing the shortfall here by loss of farm activity. But historically, this valley has been understood to have a water shortfall for 100 years. In fact, the early efforts here, where this is 1910, wells were dropping around a foot per year north Brown Road, and it led to the corporations that were investing here to encourage the state to come. And that's where Charles Lee in his report actually came from. What a lot of people don't realize is that after his report that did indeed verify the shortfall, that this was really a desert, that corporation changed its effort, hired a commercial firm to help them, an engineering firm. They put together a proposal that went to the state Conservation Commission and to a federal agency that was the forerunner of the current Department of Interior. And the proposal was to import 180,000 acre feet per year of water from the Mono Basin. This was 10 years ahead of the effort by LADWP. It was turned down by those commissions. It was subsequently discovered that LADWP had basically loaded the commissions that were responsible for the decision. That's history. The folks that have come along later have ignored that. I won't say it that, maybe shouldn't say it that strongly. They were unaware of it. Much of the activity in this valley from an early day has been based upon what amounts to promotion. The Navy's effort here, of course, had a different intention, and it could function by itself. But all the rest of us that are here enjoying this valley have been and are living on basically a borrowed situation, which is our water supply that has been realized as a problem since 1910 and before. Thank you all for listening to me again.
Thanks, Don. Thank you, Don. Okay, any last comments from board committee members? Camille?
I have a comment. Oh. Am I on now? Everyone has talked about how ag is in the crosshairs in scenario 6. I just want to remind everyone that Searles Valley Minerals is also lumped together with ag in scenario 6 with the same amount of water decreasing the same amount of time.
Thank you, Camille. Eddie?
Yeah, the authority is, I guess, worried mainly about loss of storage resulting in shallow wells going dry and mitigation costs for that. I would just like to see how confident a data we have, how many have been dried up today at today's date, and those kind of data that I think we need good confidence in before we go ahead and make other decisions based on what they have so far. I'd like to see what they have as far as wells drying up, numbers, where they're at, those kind of numbers.
I believe at one of the meetings they stated 91, but I don't
Jeff?
have that on a piece of paper.
Jeff, can you briefly answer that? What Eddie's asked for is more than could be provided at this meeting, but can you briefly touch on it?
Yes, as Judy says, there is a number out there of 91 wells that have already been impacted. But that is an estimate. I know of no one who's done a survey or compiled a list or even where the data exists to be able to confirm exactly which wells have gone dry at this time. We have not undertaken that effort. The 91 wells is an estimate that we prepared based on information we had on when wells were drilled and a method that was developed with the TAC on what the drilling methodology and standards were at the time wells were drilled to determine where the perforations in a well would be. Then we took the water level data that we had from the year that the well was drilled and changed that water level over time to the present water level, determine whether or not that well would still have water in it or not. And our estimate is that 91 wells would have been impacted.
Yeah, and then there are three or Jeff, verify this. 3 or 4 have been directly linked to a well who has gone dry, which has gone dry, including Lyles.
That is correct. We know of 3 or 4 that have, and that's kind of incidental information. That wasn't the result of any extensive search. Just as we've gathered data for a number of purposes, we have identified information that did tell us of 3 or 4.
Okay, and the numbers on the spreadsheet, matrix that are still on the screen come from the model and the wells and depths inserted and all the hydrogeology in the model. Is that correct?
That's not correct. Well, it's partially correct. It does use the future water levels generated by the model, but then it uses the same methodology as I described for the number of wells that have already been impacted. We did not have specific information on all the shallow wells in the basin to put into the model, so we used the same methodology as if we had date the wells were drilled. We used that with assumptions about the drilling practices that when it was drilled and what the water levels were at the time it was drilled, and use the future water levels from the model to determine when wells would be impacted and come up with the numbers that are in that matrix.
Yeah, I misstated it. A portion of it was the model, as you said, to determine the level, and then they used the TAC-approved methodology for judging the corresponding level and when those wells might go dry. So that was a separate study that was done by Gene, correct?
Yes.
Moran?
That's correct. Yeah, Gene Moran, our hydrogeologist, developed that with input from the TAC and a great deal of input from
Right.
John.
So the point is the model fed a second-hand constructed model, for lack of a better word, that the TAC had participated in, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Eddie, would you like any more detail on that?
Gene, we just I'm a little confused, but
redo that. What Gene Moran did was pretty accurate in hers, because the water table in 1978, when our well was originally drilled, Aaron Kirschman said the water table. 1978. Now keep that date in mind. 1978, when this well was drilled, Aaron Kirschman told me, "Okay, Lyle, the water table around here goes down about 1.5 feet every year. So I'm going to give you 100 feet of water. That way it'll last you a good long time. And so I did the math, and I figured, shit, that's going to last me until I'm past 80, right? Well, no, it didn't make it. So what she did, what Jean Moran did, is pretty accurate estimation, because I can watch it. Standing at my well today, I can walk around it, because the tank's in the way, so I got to walk around the tank, and I can see within sight. I can identify 6 or 7 wells that I know have been re-drilled or deepened or something. Now, a couple instances. One of them was kind of the homeowners a problem, because years ago I saw Kirschman re-drilling a well, and so I called Carl when he was still living and says, hey, what's going on? And he's told me, he says, well, they didn't want to go as deep as we wanted to, and their well has already gone dry because the water table was going down. So a couple of those are out there, but a lot of them, no. And so we know how fast the water table is going down in my area. It's not a hidden thing. Jean Moran had it figured out, and she was right on for that section.
I would like to point out that some of the wells that the Kern County Water Agency has been monitoring for the last 30 years have gone dry. One of them is called the Old Inyo Well, and it's in the southwest part of the valley. It's not very far from the district's well 18. It was drilled as a well to provide water for sheep that used to be run through here. The other well is a well in the southeast. It is actually southeast of the present Walmart, and it's a person used that well long ago. They are now hooked to the water district. I would also like to point out that we have known, they've passed away, but we've known people who live west of Fowler School, south of Ridgecrest Boulevard, who ended up hooking onto the water district because not only did they lose most of their water, but the water quality became poor. And when you talk about wells and the supply of water, you have, in this valley, you have to factor in water quality. We don't have some sparkly mountain stream draining into our valley with lots of nice, fresh, no-melt water. And you have to remember that.
Well, one other small piece of history, too. I really appreciated Don Decker and his about the Lee report, the Charles Lee. I read that Charles Lee report. And his final recommendation was that the Indian Wells Valley was not suitable for large-scale agriculture. That was his final conclusion. But that's not what I wanted to say. But what I wanted to say, we mentioned the new Walmart. You know what the new Walmart is, don't you? You know where it's located? It's located on an alfalfa field. Used to be. Why isn't it there anymore? Because their water went away. It got salty, and they had to quit. They lost it, and they had to move someplace else. But that's the original location of the Walmart, was an alfalfa field.
Thanks. Okay, I'd like to point out we're a couple hours into a meeting. We've just gotten to question 1, near the conclusion of it, the first part of question 1. The good news is that was the primary one they really needed answered.
I had a couple comments. I know we need to move on, but I think there's some parts of that need to go answered.
Yeah, we aren't finished with this one. I want to set the tone for where we are. We need to get through number 1. Then we have to we have to jump to number 3 because they urgently need the answer to that one, given the timeline of their ordinance. So at 4. We will jump to that one in order to get closer. Meanwhile, we'll take the time we need to close this one, and the other questions in between will, if we don't get to close, get them aired, we will do it at the next meeting. So I want to let people know what the plan is. Okay, Eddie, were you done with that?
I'm just going to spend my own money and talk to my hydrogeologist and see what he thinks as far as the confidence level in what was done.
Okay.
Rather than waste Gene's time trying to explain it to me.
Okay. Josh?
I just had a couple of comments. One would be that over in the Central Valley, we're actually in a couple of what are called waterlock districts. where even though they're in the Central Valley, which as a whole has access to some imported water, there's a lot of districts that don't have either federal or state contracts and are groundwater-only districts without recharge. We're in one of those, unfortunately. So even though we're unique in some aspects over here, there are a lot of similarities with, there's a lot of varied type of districts over in the Central Valley, and we're in like 15 of them, so we've been exposed to quite a few. Whenever we decided to move in here, the ground was ag zoned. And, we were part of the rezoning process, and we appreciate the work that was done to help us get, more beneficial zoning for some of our non-ag ground so we could try to make some use of it, and I appreciate that. But I just wanted to point that out. On this chart that's back here, when you look across and you see the white paper, things look pretty stark. And so I just wanted to get it in the record that was not done in consultation with Mojave Pistachios. That was an interpretation of a document that had been produced in conjunction with a lot of water users across the basin. And that also, when you look at imported water, every single other one has imported water. And then the white paper scenario, there's no imported water. And it even says, if you look at the little number 1, recycled water was used for both recharge and direct use in all scenarios with the exception of scenario 3, which did not have recycled water recharge. So I just point out, I would wonder if there was another line that was added in, the number of acre feet through either recharge or recycled recharge. I hate to say it, Nick, but I agree with you. How would models 4, 5, 6.1, and 6.2 look if imported water never came to fruition? They'd probably look a lot more like scenario 3, because there's about 100 to 200,000 acre feet of imported water that goes into those plans. So I just wanted to point out again that that's a bit of an unfair comparison. And I'll have a couple more comments later, but I just wanted to get those out there. Thanks.
Any other member comments? I think public comments.
Can you hear me, David?
Yes, Pat, go ahead.
I have a question. Basically, I guess, first of all, thank you to all the farmers that showed up today and shared their own personal feelings about how this is all happening. I sincerely appreciate your opinions and your comments. So that's just from me. Secondly, we pay a significant amount of taxes to Kern County. And in fact, we just, last week, were asked to, pay more taxes. And I really am struggling with what it is that Lorelei thinks we could do with our property. And maybe she could forward me somehow a list of all these things. And I'm worried that at our age, in our mid to late 70s, where, since this is our retirement income already tied up in a farm, where would we get the resources to make these things happen? I can't assume that they don't cost anything. And we have, if we wanted to redo something, is the county going to, because they've kind of, changed the plan after we farmed it, that was okay, and then all of a sudden the plug gets pulled, and now it's not okay. If we put in, say for example, we put in solar. We already have a 200K solar system, and I don't know what we're going to do with it if we don't farm. But say we put in solar all over, is that going to also have the plug pulled because somebody decides that doesn't work either? And if so, where are we falling in all this? I mean, on one hand, the county says everything is fine, go ahead, farm. The Navy never says anything about it. Nobody ever says anything about it. And we faithfully pay taxes and get our permits and do everything right. And then all of a sudden it's not okay. Now we're being told, okay, now you can change horses midstream here. Of course, you have to pay for it. And how long is that going to last? So I guess those are questions I'd like to see addressed. I don't think that anybody necessarily has an answer for them today, but I'd like to know. I really would. And is there anything that the county is offering to people who have property and they have to pay taxes on this property and all the improvements on it, how is that going to work for us? Okay, I'm out, over and out.
Thank you, Pat. We've closed public comment on this one.
I can come back up in a minute. I'll be brave. Another
Okay, if you're
as
brief,
well. Yeah, sure.
Please, we've
Just-
got to get to the next item.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. The first comment is we heard some anecdotal examples of shallow well issues. They are anecdotal, but as was pointed out, the estimates are estimates so far, and there's been no explanation of the location of where those estimated shallow well impacts occur within the basin. And that's important. And I would point out that the question is, if you pursue model scenario 6, does that really solve the shallow well impacts, and where? Does eliminating agriculture and soils solve the shallow well impacts if you don't know where the shallow well impacts are occurring? That's the point. And my last quick point is, again, we need best available science, best available information. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Okay, with that, let's go to the second half of question A. And I'll reiterate, we'll get as far as we can through A and B until 4 o'clock, and then we'll tee up C, which should be brief. I think we can do it in the 30 minutes and close out the meeting. So let's try to stay focused as best we can, not be repetitive. And with that, the next question under A, the last one is, should of that pool, whatever size it was modeled at 63.8, whatever, should a part of that pool be earmarked for dust mitigation, not shallow well mitigation, but dust mitigation, which has been brought up by some of the speakers today?
I have a question on dust mitigation. I want to know what areas you're talking about as far as dust goes. Are you talking about areas that were farmed that you don't want to be farmed that are now going to cause dust? Are you talking about areas on the base that have had dust since, the past thousands of years? Are you talking about other areas on the base that have dust occasionally during seasons when the water table moves up and cause mineral to change the landform and dust comes in the wintertime? Which dust are you talking about?
Don or Jeff, can you answer that? I have only a piece of that.
This is Jeff. My understanding is the question relates to, based on the actions that are portrayed or reflected in the modeling run, we would have, ag use dropping off over the next 10 years, and that dust question is aimed specifically at those ag properties.
So you're talking about not any current dust sources on or off base. You're talking specifically any that would be affected by ag that are, for example, that didn't pump at all in the last 5 years that might immediately be fallowed. Is that the way you understand it?
Yeah, the ones that might immediately be fallowed, and also under this a plan over, at least the way it's been modeled, under the modeling scenario, all of the ag pumping ceases, and it ceases at various times, but over the next 10 years it would all cease, and it would address this question is aimed at those lands too.
May I start?
Yes, Judy.
May I start?
Judy.
Well, first off, I'd like to say that the modeling run 6.1 and 6.2 show continued drawdown in the northeast part of the basin, which is on the Navy land. And this needs to be addressed in a modeling run because continued drawdown there is going to create dust. And Camille already mentioned dust coming from China Lake Playa, which is now dry. And the year before last, when we had a very dry winter, for the first time we could see clouds of white dust coming off the playa. This is something that will totally negatively impact the Navy, and so their North Range testing facility. So it is something that is going to have to be further addressed. As far as the ag land, there are methods of restoring native vegetation on this land that don't involve large amounts of water. The BLM, the Resource Conservation District, and the Department of Agriculture have methods which can be used that should be explored. The least amount of water used for this is really important.
So were you in support of a portion of it being used for mitigation or not?
A very small portion.
Okay, that's,
I do not think we have the luxury of I don't know how to say this without saying it negatively, squandering our water. But there are methods that can be used that don't use water. And as a matter of fact, some of those methods have been used very successfully in other places.
Other member comment? I'm sorry, Lorelei.
Can I just tee off of what Judy was saying, which is where I was going? So the East Kern Resource Conservation District works very closely with the antelope dustbusters. My recommendation is the PAC recommends not that you look at an allocation, but that part of the GSP should be to reach out to the Antelope Valley Dustbusters because they have an entire program that they've implemented. I want to also note that the Cantil situation predates the East Kern Air Pollution Control Districts and the Antelope Valley Dustbusters kind of collaboration with property owners. So they have they spend all their time working on this particular issue, and they would be better able to say how much water they think could be used for reestablishing cover crops or doing other sorts of things, or maybe it really wouldn't need water and natural rainfall would handle it. So that's just, I wanted to tee off of what Judy said, rather than trying to figure out an allocation.
Thanks, and that's a good input.
Thank you,
David, other members?
David, yes.
Comments, Lyle?
Let me, for these old folks that remembered way back when there was a thing called Solar Millennium here, they were talking about spraying something on the ground that was not water. It was some that made it that for dust control. There are chemicals that you can. I don't know what you'd take vast amounts, but and once the rains come, it kind of that stabilizes it, and then it's okay as long as you don't drive on the land. But there are other things besides water, and I didn't favor allotting water from this. You don't want a cover crop water. That's not good. But we need to look at this. That was my second sentence, I think, that I was going to, was we need to look into it and study it carefully on what we can do to control dust, because we certainly know that is going to be a problem. So,
other PAC members? Public comment.
Earl Wilson. Just a little advice. I'm on the TAC board, and 18 years on Owens Dry Lake. There are other methods to stop the dust, and it will be a problem on China Lake Playa. Sacrifice Bee Mountain. That's how DWP's been dealing with it. End of problem, agriculture, everything else. Which mountain do you want to sacrifice? I hate it, but that's what one of the solutions was on Owens Lake. Thank you.
Thank you, Earl.
Derek Hoffman, attorney for Meadowbrook. Meadowbrook's one of the larger landowners in the valley, and I would just point out that with a permanent allocation, the question of water, the question of dust mitigation should be moot as to Meadowbrook's properties.
Thank you, Derek. Any other public comment?
David, this is Pat.
Yes, Pat.
David,
Yes, Pat, you hear me?
Just to say, yes, Quist Farms has already dealt with the issue of dust, and we will continue to do it the way we've been doing it. And, you know, I don't have anything else to say except that it's not going to cost a water allocation. And it doesn't have to have any kind of foreign stuff sprayed on the ground because spraying requires water. So just to say, we've already dealt with it. We already have a plan. The plan is in place. And if you want to know what it is, come and visit the farm.
Okay, thank you. Josh?
Just a quick comment.
Okay.
I know that we can't redo history, but I would say if you had gone to Rod a number of years ago and talked to him and Paul and, you know, said, hey, we've got some ideas here, and long term, how do you see your land being used? I think we could have worked with some of the zoning that Lorelei's done, and over time, perhaps we could have transitioned some to solar, done some things, and again, with some type of a continued allocation perhaps left over for ag in general, and specifically places like Meadowbrook, you know, perhaps this wouldn't be an issue in that, you know, you would just transition your land over time as part of a business plan to lower water use things. And you know, the valley is going to look different in the future, but, you know, I think there's ways that you could avoid dust mitigation being a problem, and that's with working with landowners and trying to find alternate uses for their ground over time. So, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, what I'm hearing is, for a number of reasons, including there are alternatives. There are folks that already are doing this. There are transition alternatives, perhaps, in some case, and the case that if this plan were to go forward in some form as a part of the GSP, that we already realize we are limiting the future for ag, and we don't need to take any more out of this. But it does, dust mitigation at some level does need to be considered a part of the GSP, but not taken in the form of water out of this pool. Is that the sense I get from the committee?
Yes, and
Okay.
I'd like to point out that ag left the Cantil area, and the houses that were there got buried in sand because no dust mitigation was required of that farmer, apparently.
Okay. Well, they must not have done anything either, but okay. I
just want to say I don't really agree quite with that, because I think that accepts the premise of this Model Run 6. So my statement would be more that I think that dust mitigation should not be a problem, because the goal of the GA should not be to turn ag into a dust bowl within 5 years.
Okay, I was going to ask if we were unanimous, did we want to consider a vote? I think what I will convey is the sense of the board with your footnote or your comment.
And then I would also request that we could do, if we're going to do these recommendations in different portions, that we could do a vote on each one, so we could get a named vote on the record on these issues.
I agree with that.
I don't think we're ready to vote because I don't think we have the technical answers to the questions we were asked.
I guess so. To clarify, then, I would say before we send any type of a majority or an opinion of the board, that it be done through a vote, not just through a general consensus.
Yeah, we aren't. Okay, in this case, we have a general consensus. We didn't have a general consensus on the first one, and we would have handled it the same way we have handled every other meeting to date, which is in the report we categorize the opinions, express them so that it's never been characterized as a majority opinion and a minority, although it could have been. It's been expressed as these are the concerns of these users, these are the concerns of this other group of users. And that's the way I intended to do the report this time.
But so just to clarify, so we're going to tell the board we think this on A, we're all going to vote on it, we're going to say yes or no. We're not going to do that process.
I did not hear a consensus.
Okay.
What I heard was considerations from groups and issues and concerns that would be expressed as they have been to date in the PAC report, so that the board is aware of who we represent and the public comments. And I will tell you, in addition to that, I know for a fact that the board members watched our last meeting because they were very disappointed that they weren't able to watch it over the weekend because it wasn't posted until Monday. So the ones that had seen it in person live were feeding the others, or staff members, I should say, in particular. And they were all very happy when it got posted Monday because I know members of the board itself subsequently watched it, and I suspect there are some watching it right now, in addition to those that might be present in person. So this is one of the reasons they tasked us was, and the original purpose of the PAC was to air these issues, not only through the groups that we each individually represent, our own opinions and those groups, but also to the greater public. And they recognize in this case, when we get down to this level of decision and the nature of this, of A in particular, that there would not be a consensus of this group. And it's certainly, I wouldn't advocate let's take a Supreme Court example. If there were 9 members up here, a 5-4 decision to this board would not be a viable recommendation in my case to the board personally. They need to hear us discuss, hear the issues, get a sense of what the issues are from each of us and the public. And that was the purpose of this group. If we can reach a consensus, by all means.
Are you hearing a consensus? I'm a little confused about where you want to go with this. Are you saying you have heard a consensus subject to 1 or 2 footnotes, or where are you?
What I heard with respect to this issue, should a separate proportion of the 63.8 or whatever the pool is, should a separate portion of that be carved out for use of the water that's being carved out in a dust mitigation role? And what I heard was, A, we don't know what would be required. B, in many cases, it's not necessary. But the GSP does need to include, based on more detailed engagement, as Lorelei proposed, with folks that are involved in this, the GA needs to address dust mitigation that may come if this or any of the other scenarios, because we're going to have less water in this valley no matter what we do. There are liable to be dust mitigation issues. So what I heard all of us we're saying for a variety of reasons that they spoke, and I tried to summarize, that we don't support carving anything out of this allocation for dust mitigation, handle it separately in the GSP. That's what I meant by a consensus.
Okay,
Yes.
well, if you're counting noses, I'm not a part of that consensus. I'm looking for not a carve-out as it's necessarily defined here, but someone has to pay for dust mitigation. And I'm thinking it will be directly or indirectly related to the allocation through the sale or lease of the water from that pool or use of water from that pool. That's the position I've taken in writing that this group has seen. So if that's different, then...
Okay, then you wrote that down, and that'll be submitted as a part of it. I would have said that my position was it should be addressed separately. It does need to be taken up. It does need to be allocated. Whatever the resource required, money, water, et cetera, should come out of a separate piece of the GSP for consideration. And that's not the consensus opinion I will express. I will express, footnote's the wrong word, your piece of it. Thank you. Is everybody on board with that?
I just have a concern. I don't understand that we're not going to be able to need any water. I think there's going to be some need for some amount of water.
And so there could be, and we're asking...
I don't want to go into this thinking, oh, we're not going to need any water, so we don't have to come up with any kind of allotment for it.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I don't think it should come out of this pool.
I want to make sure that there is water available if we need it for dust mitigation.
Okay, and that'll be part of the report.
I don't want to go into it with the thought, oh, we're not going to need any water, so forget it, got it. That's where I stand.
Thank you. Available if needed. as part of the plan. I heard somebody click. Are we closed with this one?
Yes.
Okay. We got 25 minutes. Let's take a shot at starting B.
B or C?
I'm sorry. No, C would start at 4. We're going to start C at 4 if we need to, and we'll stop B if we haven't gotten through it. I'm hoping we can get through the first part of it. That may be optimistic. If this ag industrial pool or some pool at some number, based on the ag portion of it in particular, I'm not sure exactly how they proposed handling Searles Valley minerals as it was included in the original Scenario 6 pool. How should the pool be allocated to eligible pumpers? And the questions were, on the basis of each producer's lowest water use during the 2010 through 2014 calculation period, or on the percentage of acreage farmed by each producer during the calculation period. What was incorporated in the model was the percentage of acres farmed by each producer during the calculation period, with the intent of it being more equitable with regards to water usage for more or less efficient crops, rotation, etc. The alternative that they proposed here is mining it based on past water use, and we have a table that was referenced earlier. It's a 2-page table that shows page 1, table 1, summary allowed pumping for non-domestic group pumpers under Scenario 6 using irrigated acres. The back of the sheet, or the second sheet if you didn't print front to back, is using lowest annual water use from the Sigma start period, 5 years preceding Sigma, for prescriptive rights, 2010, 2014. And you can see the differences depending on which ag pumper was doing what, and they made an assumption also for Searles with notes 5, 6, and 7 on the lowest annual water use, and no assumption for Searles on using irrigated acres, as we have already addressed, and Camille has addressed, and their attorney has addressed in the document that he provided us before this meeting. So what they chose to do in their estimation was the most equitable to all pumpers, including past decisions on how to efficiently use their water and future decisions on how to use their water, was that it should be based on use of irrigated acres. And this is the data they had. If they went with this method, they would in fact, or the other one, they would in fact go back and re-verify the data before they allocated any of this. So that's the question before us.
I just have a comment to make up front, basically that I reject the premise that question B is asked upon. This is absolutely in no way Sigma. This whole 2010 to 2014 prescriptive period is, I'm going to go way out of my league here and use lawyer terms. This is adjudication case law and jurisprudence. This is not Sigma. So I will say that perhaps a better question for B should be, how should the total volume of water that can be safely extracted from the basin while avoiding undesirable results be allocated between domestic, non-domestic, ag, and industrial users? If there's not enough water, what should be done to meet that shortfall? So I'm saying this is the wrong question to be asked.
You're going back to question A.
I'm going to question B. How should the ag industrial pool be allocated to eligible pumpers? That's the wrong question. The question is, how much of the overall volume of water that can be safely extracted from the basin while avoiding undesirable results, which is what Sigma states, how should that water be allocated to the basin in general? And in my mind, that's a policy question that we should ask. The Navy should get their water because of their Federal Reserve right, but then how does the rest of that water get allocated?
Did you write that down, Josh?
Did I write that down?
No, yeah, so I can have it for the report.
Yeah. And so then the rest of that water, if we do decide that it all does need to go to domestic users and none goes to ag, how do you compensate ag? I mean, those are the types of policy questions here. I'm just saying that SGMA was not written to be a way to do an administrative seizure of land without any compensation.
We would agree with that also.
I would agree with that also.
I agree as well.
I agree with Josh as well.
There needs to be a buyout of some kind, or not use the allocation method, use another method.
David, okay. I was going to wait until the last line in the B statement there. It says, other thoughts and factors the authority board should consider. That's the last question.
That's the question we're answering now. Josh brought up that.
Okay, very good, because I will.
But let's go back.
I want to answer that. I have something for you.
Which one do you want?
Yes.
Which one do you want to answer?
I want to answer that. Other thoughts and factors.
Answer what? Which one?
That's the last question in B.
Other thoughts and factors?
Yeah, other thoughts and factors in B.
Okay, so
we've
all jumped A is what I'm saying.
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
I think so.
I'm B. I'm sorry, we've jumped B1. We're in B2.
Yes. Okay. Yes, there is. And what I'm going to leave with you. I think we've addressed it before, but the domestic well owners have a groundwater sustainability plan that we have spent a lot of time on. It is market-based, a bunch of advantages to it, and I know there'll be some others, but I want to leave that copy with you, and we would like to see it on the agenda. It's just a short thing, outline of the plan, and then how it can be implemented is another few pages too. And I'd like to leave that with you and get that into the record. It may have already been in the record. But
it is already in the record.
Yes, but we would like to do it again, and I will hand you a copy when we adjourn here of it to put in the plan, along with what I have, my notes for today. So, but anyhow, I just wanted to get that out. I know we're short of time. I don't want to waste a bunch of time on it right now.
Okay,
but we have a plan.
So. Okay, let me try to come back to A and phrase it a different way. If it were to go forward, that the way it has been constructed to date and presented to us was that this is a pool that's going to contain ag and Searles, maybe or maybe not, but the way it was given to us, if this pool, for whatever the allocated number is, and right now it's 63.8 in terms of the model, if this pool or some form of it goes forward for ag, how should the allocation within that pool be calculated? Should it be based on acres, or should it be based on pumping during that 5-year period?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Lorelei.
Is this language that came to us from the board?
That was written directly and written by staff and approved by the board.
So I just wanted to ask a question. The people who stood up the 3 farms that said the 2014 is something the legislature gave us. You can't go beyond 2014. That was given to us in the SGMA legislation. The pumping before that was apparently designed. This language says the lowest water use during. It doesn't say anything about continuous. So I was just wanted to ask if the PAC was also interested in perhaps commenting back to the board about those 3 farms. I just wanted to offer that because this word says lowest water use during that. It doesn't say anything about lowest continuous water use. Just wanted to be a fair broker and point out that you do have the right to say we'd like you to look at those other 3. I think there's 3 farms.
Yeah, you're pointing out that perhaps you're looking. You're looking for the option here that might address those farms that didn't pump at some point in those 5 years, and the lowest gives them the option versus what was indicated on one of the previous charts of, okay, but the lowest, if they didn't pump in one of those years, is still the lowest, which is 0. If they didn't pump in one of those years. I misunderstood.
No, the lowest of the number of times they pumped before 2014. 2014 is the
Right.
cutoff by the legislature. If you
Right.
started planting after 2014, there's nothing we can do about that. But if they pumped 2 out of those 4 years before 2014, between 2010 and 2014, what is that number? I don't know. That's
So
just
you're
a
saying lowest
methodology
if they
thought.
pumped any year.
They
the
pumped
lowest,
any year. What's the lowest of the any year they pumped?
Lowest
Is that
in
another
any
way
of
to
the
say
5
it?
years.
And I will just say generally, absolutely, Sigma was not written to put people out of business. It was written to provide local control, to use innovative new tools to try to solve a water solution. And so I think absolutely we should try to look at Simmons and the others that were cut off through this arbitrary decision to use this time period.
I think much more research needs to be done on this subject. And a good example are the Simmons and Mr. McGee, I guess. They are not included in this. There are many small pistachio farms, I guess is what I've noticed the most, that are scattered around here and there, 5 acres, 10 acres, whatever, that have been planted in recent years. I don't have a feeling that the board or staff actually know the true number of non-de minimis users they have. I think they need to find that out. I think they need to look at including people other than pistachio farmers and alfalfa farmers. There are people who raise and board horses. I have no idea how much water a horse takes, but I'm sure it's a lot, and I'm sure John can tell me. There are other animal agricultural enterprises as well. If we're going to single out a couple of farmers, we need to make sure that what we do for farmer A is also done for farmer B.
Okay, I would agree with Lorelei and that approach. I think that is, I think that's more equitable for those that didn't pump part of the time. I originally was going to go with the 2010, 2014. If you didn't pump all 4, you didn't get any. That is sort of draconian. So I would, the lowest of that would be good.
Okay, what I'm hearing so far, I think I'll try to capture it in the interest of time, is a consensus that the board consider adjusting this to the lowest of any year you pumped in the 5. And would it be fair to say, I haven't heard a lot on this either way, but in the interest of time, that acreage is the most equitable versus pumping? So pumping establishes the calculation if you pumped in any one of the 5 years, and then it's based on acreage. Is that what I'm hearing from most folks?
You're hearing that from Pat.
Anybody disagree with that?
Did you hear me, David?
Yes, I did, Pat. I'm sorry. I should have responded.
I disagree on the acreage because
That's okay.
I think there have been many acres planted after Sigma was enacted.
Well, then they wouldn't be eligible because it's 2010 to 2014.
I would like to hear again what you are trying to get a consensus on.
Okay, I was hoping the recording would say what I said.
Well, I don't
okay,
hear
I
very
got you.
well.
I got you, Eddie. No, it's a disease as you age. You can only say something right once, if it was good. What I'm hearing is eligibility for the pool, if the pool comes to being, and I'm writing this down so I can capture this if the video fails tomorrow. Eligibility would be determined on your lowest of any year you pumped in the 5, including if you only pumped 1 year at one end of the extreme. If you pumped 4 but you missed 1 year for whatever, you switched crops or something like that, you wouldn't be out. It would be the lowest of any years that you pumped in the 5 on an annual basis.
David?
Yes, I'm talking about...
Or acreage.
No, that's part 2. First part was eligibility. So eligibility to be in the pool would be from 2010 to 2014, anyone who did 1 year, 1 to 5, and the lowest in that 1 to 5. Then the second piece of it would be, once you have that allocation, it's based on acreage irrigated. That 1 year or the lowest of, well, the 1 year that was the lowest for whether you pumped 1 year or 5 years.
I know in other adjudications, if you weren't continuously pumping, you were not eligible.
I know. We're making a recommendation otherwise.
I'm not ready to do that, at least for me.
Dave,
Okay.
I am not ready either to make that recommendation.
Okay.
And just briefly, I give the GA the benefit of the doubt for the options they gave us here. And I'm sure they gave very careful consideration to options other than those that they presented to us. For my part, I could make equally strong arguments for the acreage or production from an equity standpoint. And that's why in my write-up to this group, I punted on that, so take your pick.
Okay.
But in the add-on, what should you consider, I suggested that whatever would be most justifiable from a California historic law perspective should be considered. In other words, I am bouncing that ball back to Markman and the group.
I think that's the appropriate place for the question,
Okay.
not us.
Well, and that's part of why
agree with
that's
Eddie.
part of why it got to us the way it is, by the way. But, yeah.
And I would echo that as well, that a lot of this is technical and legal, and it's difficult to sit here. I don't, personally, I don't agree with that. I reject the whole premise of the question altogether. But it's just hard here because we're talking about people's retirement, being put out of business and them being shuttered. And so, I kind of feel like it's a little bit like the board told us to get in a circular firing squad, and we all get a gun and we get to choose who gets to survive or not and pick the winners and losers. And that's a really tough position to be in. And so, I would like to support that statement, but I kind of reject the overall premise that they should be put in that position in the first place.
Okay. I think I've got the idea of what
I just
we're
want-
not going to get a consensus on this, but we have some general, I think we've given them enough information to feed their process.
I didn't see it as a two-step process. I believe the question was, which one do you prefer, Table 1 or Table 2?
It was,
And
but we're not getting a consensus on that.
Well, how can you get a consensus on a number that's thrown out 63,000 and some odd acre feet when you don't even know if that number is correct? It's putting the cart
The
before
question
the horse.
is
Excellent question.
The question is regardless of that number, it's how would you allocate within that number? Whatever the number is. And perhaps we can give them some of the information from here, and they will watch this. And if they send us back with more clarification to answer it, they do. Because those are the things that are the next steps in the modeling and the GSP development itself. So in the interest of trying to get to number C, if there's brief public comment on this, we will entertain that.
I just wanted to make one quick observation
Renee.
regarding these two different charts. One discussing the watering via acreage, the other one lowest annual water use. It appears that the largest ag pumper loses 1 year in the business if they go with the acreage. But the small ag businesses all lengthen their time for staying in business because they'll get more water through the acreage.
That's why they thought it was more equitable. I'm sorry, that's why they thought it was more equitable for the purposes of the model to go that way. Plus, it allows the owner-operators to change crops, do within the period, do whatever they like to help themselves with regards to water usage.
And I just want to get on the record that we're at over $25 million invested in our pistachio fields, and that 8 months is, you can't do anything with 8 months.
Got it. Okay, did I see brief public comment, please?
Thank you, Derek Hoffman, attorney for Meadowbrook, and I emphasize attorney because I think I'm probably the only one in the room today. And as I mentioned in my letter, these are legal questions. They're not policy questions. And so I think it's important to note that, as many of you have. I think it's a little bit unfair to ask the PAC to make legal determinations. I appreciate the opportunity for discussion, of course, but again, these are legal issues. And typically, these concepts, self-help, prescription, et cetera, correlative rights, it's used to determine permanent allocations. And so I would say that under either scenario, Meadowbrook, again, should have a permanent allocation of groundwater. I would also point out that, like Josh was saying, the premise is important. We can't just shrug off the premise to answer the subsidiary question in terms of how it ought to be allocated if you accept the premise. I think there's no consensus on the underlying premise, and therefore it's difficult also to answer this question of how water ought to be allocated among a non-domestic user group. And I note also, as stated in my letter, that there are no questions posed about domestic users, about how that water ought to be allocated and whether there ought to be conservation by that group. It seems a bit one-sided to me to ask the PAC to try to weigh in on the fate of one group without being tasked to consider the fate of the other groups. And I also noted in my letter that there are legal questions pertaining to the assumption that the domestic group is completely exempt from any ramp down. And I framed some of those questions, those legal questions, in my letter. I'm not asking that you entertain those because, again, I think those are legal questions that ought to be considered in a different venue. And finally, because I'm trying to be brief, remember, too, that Model Scenario 6 was developed in closed session, and the reason that it was developed in closed session was because of, as it was described, legal issues. So I think you're seeing that reflected here in the question, and I think there are opportunities to discuss those questions, but I just think this is going to be difficult for all of you to really weigh in on those.
Thank you, Derek.
And I don't think you're in a position to make informed decisions. And
Okay.
that's no offense to you, but I just think that's the nature of the question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
David, are you listening to Pat?
Yes, Pat.
I just, in my letter, I mentioned the fact that different farms with different operations are going to see this in a different way. And as far as I'm concerned, from my point of view, if this has to happen this way, I would choose the acreage. But that said, I don't want to throw anybody else under a bus by saying that it has to be that way for everybody. I don't know that for a fact, that it has to be. And I don't know if it's legal or not legal or anything else. I just know what's right for me. So all I'm asking is maybe go back to the drawing board a little bit on that. And, if it's necessary or not, I don't know. But whichever it is, I would have to say for myself and probably other small farms, acreage would be the option that they would choose. Like I said, though, I think they deserve to be asked that question, each one. And one more thing. I think that when this all happens and people find out that there's an allocation and they haven't registered a well or stepped up to say they're part of ag at all, and they've been hiding in the woodwork, I think they're going to come out of the woodwork, and you're going to have a lot more than 4 or 5 or 6 farms to deal with here. So I would like to have that question answered before we move too far forward on this.
Thank you, Pat. Larry?
Yes, Larry Mead again. Are you going with the 63,000 plus acre feet, or are you going to set that aside then?
We didn't set anything aside. We submit all the comments that were made.
I'd like you guys to give some serious thought. There's a couple folks up there at your committee that maybe understands this, but you better give some real serious thought on the 63,000 acre feet, and not about farming with it, but if you're going to take dust control out of that, you better give this some thought, because do you guys have, you were talking one time 21 or 2,500 acre feet for dust control, right?
The dust control one we didn't agree on.
Oh, I thought you talked about 2,500 acre feet. But anyway, you got to give some real serious thought. 2,500 acre feet of water is nothing. You could put 20,000 acre feet on 1,000 acres, maybe to get a cover crop. The weather enters into it. You're talking about blowing heavy, sandy gravel in the Northwest. You might really consider this. I mean, I've had pivots out there blowing mud balls out at 115, 20-mile-an-hour winds. So you could use a lot of water up.
Thank you, Larry. Okay, any last public comment? That was yeah, let's not lengthen the meeting. Okay, let's go to question C, and what's on the table before us is, and it's because they need to urgently do this after the next meeting, assuming they approve the ordinance on its second reading. What method do you think the GA should use to reach out to small well owners in order to notify them of the upcoming mandatory well registration that would be the outcome of that ordinance? And they gave options, 3 options, and others, Pat has suggested one other as well: postcard, letter, or billboards.
Okay, can I start?
Can I start? I have some information on cost that may factor into this.
Okay, real quick.
So based on our experience, the Water District just put up billboards in town. You may have seen them. A 10 by 30 billboard, it's to have it up is $405 a month. To set it up, there's a $500 to $600 printing and installation cost, depending on what you put on it. The issue with billboards, of course, is where do you put it and how much you can put on it. We usually try and keep the message simple because people typically are passing by it at 45 to 55 miles an hour. And if you have a lot of information on there, they're going to probably end up off the road or causing an accident. So that's been our experience. The most recent postcard that was sent out by the Groundwater Authority was that one with requesting private well owners to register. And that one, that was an 8.5 by 5.5 postcard. And we sent out, we had 3,000 printed, and the cost was $1,309.24. The issue with that was, of course, we had no complete list of all the private well owners. We did the best we could in filtering out Water District customers and such, but the fact is there are some customers that are Water District customers but have a well, and some people were missed. So there's pluses and minuses that maybe get the discussion started.
Okay, what does it cost for a letter?
We haven't sent out a letter.
Well, how much for a postcard versus, do you pay a special bulk mail rate?
Yes.
So it's cheaper than what it would cost a non-entity.
Yeah, I don't have a cost for the letter. I don't know if you sent out any experience.
Okay. Well, let's talk first about, and we have 30 minutes left here, so
okay.
What do we think is needed?
I would like to start.
Yeah, just
Lyle asked,
I was trying to. Lorelei sent out zoning ones to all APMs, and that's what I'm going to suggest. I know it's expensive. However, let me just. I got to read a couple things here for you. The creation of a mandatory well registration ordinance should have been an agenda item on the Policy Advisory Committee prior to the first reading before the Groundwater Authority Board on the 18th of July. Now, this is what we do, I think, and that was kind of like blindsided. What is this? Okay, but anyhow, based on the less than stellar results of the voluntary well registration, making well registration mandatory at this time will more likely result in nearly the same outcome. A very large incentive, not defined, would need to be offered to encourage well owners to comply, or a very, very large hammer would have to be shown. A significant simplification of the registration form could help the response. I also suspect a fairly large percentage of well owners in the valley may not know or have or understand the questions that are on that form or the information requested that is being asked for on that current form. Simplify that form. Well owner receiving a mass mailing would therefore just ignore the mandatory form, particularly if the well owner cannot see any benefit in his own situation for registering as well. There's just no. A personal mailing to each APN in the valley that includes a required registration form, because you get a postcard, you got to go find a form then. The chances of there will be good chances of reaching all domestic well owners. Understand the cost involved, but the shortcomings of the modified postcard mailing list that was used for voluntary well registration was quite apparent, because I was one of the domestic well owners that didn't get one. Okay, so anyhow, those are my thoughts on it.
So you didn't recommend which to use?
Oh, I didn't. I don't recommend. Well, I'm saying a mailing, a letter, a personal.
A letter is what you're saying.
Personal mailing letter to all APN numbers in the valley, because we don't know who all the. Yeah, I know we're talking big bucks here, Laurel. I understand that.
I would like to point out that some months ago, Mrs. Oviatt sat where she is right now and told all of us to get the APN numbers and to use that to communicate with the well owners. That's what needs to be done. However, unfortunately, the board has gone about all of this backwards, and they now have many well owners who don't want to have anything whatsoever to do with this. They'll tell you that. How are they going to repair the damage they have already done? That's a good question. I agree with Lyle that I think a letter needs to go to every APN well number in the county. It needs to include a simplified registration form that was given to the GA board by the well owners a long time ago. But maybe it's time, Ron, for the GA board to kind of just hold a meeting, not a board meeting, not time limits, maybe renting a room in the Kerr-McGee and setting up some tables and sit around and talk to people. I know we all thought it was silly when Skip Gorman stood up here and said something about having a barbecue or something, but you have alienated a lot of people. You have alienated the domestic well owner. You've certainly alienated the farmer, large and small. We need to work together for the future of water in this valley. We have a limited supply. The population of the world is growing. Where's the water going to come from? Those people will forget eventually that we had an earthquake and come back. There's a supply and demand problem. The state has said we have to solve it. You need to get the people on your side, whether they're agriculture, a domestic well owner, a water district customer, a person who lives in Trona, Seals Valley Minerals. And in order to do it, you're going to have to be open, plain communication, and you're going to have to be equitable.
Comment. Just to reconfirm, Lyle, your idea was an APN letter with the registration form included. And I agree with that. I would not simplify that form. My examination of it revealed to me that everything on there was relevant, and I would not like to see it dumbed down. Let's keep it, let's go APN, and let's get out a letter. It's always subject to cost. I know, I don't know of a better way, so thank you.
Other thoughts?
I think, well, with regard to sending a letter, I think the last time we sent out something like that was 16,167, and I think there's, 950 or so wells. So you're going to be sending out a letter and a well form to I'll get one at my house, and as will a lot of people that don't really need it or care to see that. So I don't know how you reconcile it. We tried to filter that list the last time and did the best we could, but obviously didn't reach everybody. But to send it to 16,000 people.
Right, I agree. So you take the city limits and the streets within the city limits out of it.
That's what we did.
Okay, just to clarify, I don't know why you didn't get a letter. I don't know where your tax bill goes. These are not people's addresses. Wherever your tax bill goes for your piece of property is the only addresses that we have access to. That's the address we have access to. We pulled them. We do this all the time. Hundreds of these notices go out. We provided them to the water district. The water district took out their customers. Their customers obviously aren't going to register a well. So we took out their customers. There's lots of duplicates. If you own more than one piece of property, there's lots of duplicate things. We took out the duplicates. Maybe that was a mistake because then people thought you were only talking about one APN. I didn't think about that.
And we also removed, there's property owners that live out of state that probably don't have a well. That we made that assumption, so we took those out.
Okay, I think that maybe that's a bad mistake. I mean, I don't know if that's...
And there are well owners that also have municipal service.
Yes.
Correct.
That's one that... Do we know who those are?
Yes, we're one.
We don't know all of them now.
Well,
what do you mean municipal service? You mean they have a private well plus they're also hooked up to the water district?
Yes. There's more of them than we think.
Don Joe McKernan.
That's interesting. Okay, so...
so you don't take those out.
So, and what was your response? You sent out 3,000. What was your response? How many did you get back?
2.
I mean, how many people?
2 registered.
2 registered.
Yes.
And how many wells did you think there were in that 3,000?
I believe Stetson has something like 950.
Yeah, it's in the 700s.
Around 950 wells.
Okay, so the other possibility that you could do, yes, you could resend that. One, I did see the notice, and I'm just coming from my experience at dealing with public notices. That is way too dense information. I would have thrown it I would not have thought I was supposed to do anything. It's just too much information.
But we had a photo from Don Decker.
I understand, and that was good too. But it was still too much information. If you want people to send something back, you have to say, you can't use the word domestic well, for example. You have to say, do you have a water well? Does it provide water for your whatever? You have to really get this down to someone saying with big letters, you need to register, or something that's, something on yellow paper. So that's just another thing that I just think you need to think about. The other possibility is that we then, if we have 975 wells, that we circle back to Matt Constantine at Public Health and we get the addresses for those wells. And I'm just curious about why we didn't go down that road. Why are we not just getting the addresses for those wells? Every well in unincorporated Kern County and Inyo County and San Bernardino County has to have an address in order to get a well permit.
Except for wells prior to 1980 is what we've been told. Wells drilled before that.
Okay, but there's one 1980 is a long time ago.
Lorelei,
so I'm just saying.
I realized one of my
think?
problems why I didn't get things. Okay, I have my original drilling log from Kirschman. Well, I noticed that Nicole from Stetson Engineers had a Xerox copy of it. I just discovered it. Where'd you get it? I don't know. But anyhow, one of the problems on the address that is on that, well, it was 1978, the only address I have. Guess what? That address does no longer exist. Exactly. It's about 2 blocks in front of Burroughs High School. If you go over there, look in front of Burroughs High School, there's desert out there. Well, it used to be 1809 Whittington. Well, that street address no longer exists. Right. But that's was on the original well permit.
Okay. Well,
but when I deepened and had a new permit, right? I wonder whatever happened to it, because no one ever saw that. I never saw it.
Let me try to help get to closure here. What I'm hearing so far is we're pointing at probably more communication is better with less when we do it. Folks are thinking a letter with the form. There's disagreement about simplified versus not. But we think a letter. Pat, I would suggest to everybody who hasn't read Pat's suggestion is that aligned with this is the long-term issue that the counties need to consider mandatory well registration upon any action taken with the land as a method. If you want to sell your land, you've got to have a registered well, those kinds of things over the long run to capture it. And there's another component of what Pat talked about, which is getting people on board for the positive aspects of the problem we all share in the valley. And some of that is peer pressure. I'm on board, I'm paying my fair share, why aren't you? And so the longer term, the more folks that have them, the better it will go with regards to that point. And over time, if any transaction involving the land at all requires a well registration, that captures more and more of even the holdouts. Lorelei, you have to comment on that.
We appreciate, it's not my area, except I just point out that the Kern County, Inyo County, and San Bernardino County does not regulate groundwater. That is the GSA. And so a well registration with the information that was requested, which talked about volume of water produced and things like that, you're asking the county to take over the groundwater agencies because wells are registered. Public Health has every well permitted, and if you want to build a house, we ask, do you have a well? So we're not, but that ordinance would go further and say that we're responsible for collecting information on how much water is pumped. I can't speak for all 3 counties, but that's what the GSA is supposed to be doing.
Right.
So I think
but
that's the
your
issue.
point is about the basic registration. Let me ask you, if I have a property that after building I put a well in and I chose not to let you know about it.
You can't. That's illegal. Public Health, the driller.
People do a lot of illegal things.
I understand, but in the case of water wells, the driller will permanently lose his certification, and there isn't one driller
but all the
here
ones
who would do that.
All the ones that happened in the past, is there anything that says if I sell my property, I have to prove that my well is registered?
It's not registered. You have to prove that it's permitted through Public Health. That is up to realtors, title companies. The building department says, do you have a well? If we see an older well that was drilled in 1965, yes, they go check the records. Has it been checked? Has it been deepened? Is there a thing? But we don't look at the amount of water pumped, and that's the difference. The GSA is looking at the amount of water pumped. We're not in the water pumping
I'm with you,
business.
and it could be once they have that registration, they can go be responsible for that. The question is, if I have property in the
unincorporated area.
In the unincorporated area, thank you. And I had a well drilled on it years ago, but it's not in the records anywhere for whatever reason. If I sell that land, does anybody check to see if
when you come in to do something? For example, you can't, if you come in to get a building permit, so if you sell me that property, right? First of all, it's fraud if you sold me that property and that well is not permitted, and you get to go back to your title company and get your money back, and you can sue all these people, and that's what Derek's here for. And so then you can, if you come in to get a building permit, and we're not going to let you use that well. Absolutely, you will not be able to build a house. You will not be able to build a house. You will not be able to use it for whatever it is. I know I agree there are lots of illegal things that happen, but surprisingly enough, water wells are one of the few places because the water drillers are on the hook. I mean, water drillers have been cited for deepening without getting a permit and have been cited by public health on a number of occasions, and then they stop. They will not do that anymore.
Okay,
Originally,
let's come back.
Because it's a health issue.
Okay, let's come back to try and, do we agree that a letter is probably the preferred method? And that we take some care, we've said, this committee has said this before, about how it's written, the advantages, the stick and carrot portion. Is that generally where we are? We were asked a method, and we're saying a letter is probably the best. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes. And just one follow. I could not get building permits to build my house until I had an approved source of water.
Okay.
That's exactly the way it works.
Okay.
Yeah.
Renee?
I have a question. Where are you going to get the addresses again? Because you talked about APN, and now Lorelei has brought up about the health department. Did they have all the addresses for all the wells? Is that where we should go to get the database?
I don't know why we don't do that. But you got it from the APNs. I don't think you got the actual well locations. We just sent them to all the unincorporated areas, correct?
Can we get
so let me look into that.
Is there anything better we can do?
Let me look at
Okay, Lorelei will look in to see what is the best we
I'll
can do and work
coordinate with Inyo County and San Bernardino County. Can we
Okay.
not just start with that list and see how, if we want to expand it against the APNs? We tried the APNs. Perhaps we take the list of well addresses and send it to that, however many there are, 975, and say, hey, you have a well. Here's the next thing that needs to happen.
Okay,
We have an address for our well, but we don't get mail there.
I know, we would cross-reference it with the
All
APNs.
right.
Okay, let's go to public comment.
I have a
And let's-
question before public comment.
Okay, Camille.
For the purposes of outreach, I actually like the idea of a billboard or something warning people that you're going to be sending a letter out, as opposed to just having a letter appear. When letters appear and it's not from somebody you know, the tendency to toss them is extremely high. So they may not even get open to see that there's a form in there. But if you have a billboard or something like that that people are going to see as they pass by, then I think, or a series of meetings with the public. You could have displays at the hardware stores and things like that, or gas stations, in Inyakern. There's a variety of outreach things that we can do ahead of time before sending the letter.
Yeah, I agree. And I should have captured that in my summary. I'm trying to make sure we don't get kicked out of here. I think meetings, the billboards, and a letter as the kind of coup de grace, giving all the detail or more of the detail in a fashion that they can go with. With that, let's go to public comment and obviously the Inyakern hardware. If Don, you're about to say that's one of the places it should be posted to.
Yes, I think, Don Decker again, the Inyakern hardware store is the general store of the rural community. And it's by far and away the best location for any kind of communication. In fact, if you want to pass a secret, that's how you do it. What I wanted to comment on here was to clarify what the simplified well registration form that the domestic well owners put together and was ultimately looked at by legal staff of the GA board. It's posted online at this point. It's not hidden away in some drawer. The thing that's different about it from the general registration is that it doesn't require any information about your electric meter and what water meter you may have, who made it, what its capacity is, and all that kind of thing. None of that is there. It is a simple registration. If you pull it down, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's one page. It doesn't require any calculations, and it doesn't have any confusion by having all the different items on it that are on the general registration form that was really intended for the non-de minimis pumpers that would be required to report pumping. Having that stuff on a de minimis registration, a domestic registration, is absolutely, totally unacceptable in terms of the reaction that will occur. So the simplified form has name, your mailing address, the location of the well, and that's about it. The top of the form contains that request. At the bottom of the form, there's about 3 or 4 lines that ask you to indicate if you know details of your well, when it was drilled, how large the pump motor combo is, and some simple things that a lot of people will know and would volunteer. So the simplified form is absolutely the way to do it. You can argue that it should be even simpler. It should just have the very top lines. Your name, your address, where the well is located, end of form. A lot of people would be more likely to respond to that than the what we've been calling our simplified form. Do not send the general form that has the metering and all the rest of that. That would be equivalent to another PR disaster. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. Any other public comment?
Earl Wilson again. How do you sort out all the people that don't have wells from and an APN number? You send a certified letter with receipt return on it. You save all the ones that come back that are unsigned in a box. Eventually, you'll find out that either they refuse to sign it, which is contrary to the ordinance and subject to a fine. But you have to do this after the ordinance is done. You need a big PR campaign somewhere, or you aren't going to get any type of cooperation at all. The cards were a bad idea. You go to the mailbox. What's this? Throw it away. Certified signature required with the return card. That's the way you do it. Thank you.
Thanks, Earl. Any other public comment? Or next item?
Can we bring it back to the board?
We have a public comment. We're going to have to shut down here.
Are you not going to let me speak, Nick?
Go ahead.
Thank you. I would suggest, like Camille said, you do more than one item. I know it's expensive, but it depends on what kind of success rate you want out of your effort. I would put up a couple of billboards. I would send, Earl just said what I said last week, send certified letters to everybody you can sort through, you can weed down the list a little bit, but that's the way to do it. And then any of the social events that are going on, like the Petroglyph Festival, the fair, I'd have the GA have somebody there to register wells. Those are places where you can visit with people. You can explain things. You may get people that are hesitant to register, but if you explain it to them in not this environment, but a more casual environment, you may get some more participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Quick, Nick.
Don Decker's comment. I think, Don, you and I are coming from a very different place here. Where I'm coming from is an assumption that de minimis users are going to be regulated on the amount they pump. We can't, as I've pointed out before and everyone seems to know, we can't force them to meter. We can't force them to report. But there's nothing that says that our GSP cannot regulate the amount that they pump. And because of my concerns about health and safety, the more complete form has data on inside use, outside use, and so forth that could be extremely relevant to any needed attempt to regulate the amount of pumping by de minimis pumpers. So that's why I'm arguing for a more complete form. I don't disagree that there's going to be a lot of resistance. A lot of it's going to go in the garbage. You still have to go for the data as best you can.
Thanks.
The thing that needs to be realized is we're talking here about registration. We're not talking about regulation. They're two separate things. First you register, and then you worry about how you're going to do whatever comes next.
Thanks, Don. Okay. We have 3 more agenda items. We're going to go through them real quick. Future agenda items.
I have one question regarding the billboards. How long will we have the billboard for?
As long as they want to pay
Would
for
it take 3 months or 6 months?
Whatever the experts who have experience with billboards say, and you did them before, Don, so I would assume what the industry is aware of what it takes to get a message out, and that would probably advise. Do you have any comment, Don?
Well, there's a time frame to get the wells registered. They have to be registered by a certain date, so that dictates the time the billboards are up.
Yeah.
I would think.
Well, assuming you're going to have them all registered by then, but yeah, okay. All right, item number 4 is that's a placeholder. Those are the future agenda items that were talked about last time. I would expect that they could change out of the GA itself. We could be tasked to go more into depth to anything today that we were limited by time. Item number 5 was future meeting dates. Those haven't changed. If there is a need for an urgent date, I'll let you know the instant I know, and we'll poll like we did for this special meeting. So I think those are the existing dates that are planned. I expect we'll have some tasking, as I said, out of the GA next month. So down to final member comment, and please keep it brief. We're running into, they're getting ready for the city council meeting. Let's start with Tim. Anything?
None.
Thank you. Camille?
I would like, excuse me.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I just want to say that in other GSPs, it appears to be that they have a more general plan, and then the details are left later to fill in. So just from a philosophical standpoint, I'm wondering why this particular GSA group seems to be so focused on extreme detail. I'm just curious because I've looked through a bunch of other plans recently, and they seem to have a large general framework with a whole bunch of projects and things they're planning on working on, and it doesn't appear that we are going in that route. It's just a comment.
Thank you, Camille. Judy?
I think it's a good question to ask the board, actually. Her comment.
Anything else?
And yes, I would like my written response given to the board.
Thank you. Lyle?
Okay, I did have something I was going to cover, but I'll tell you what, in the instance of time, I'll do it. We'll do it later. But it was something that was in both of the attorney letters that I think I thought, simple-minded, a simple response to, and I can share that later. So we'll do it now for time. So
Wes?
Just briefly, it seems to me that we were once given and never really fleshed out an allocation task, and we've mentioned a well owner's allocation scheme and other ideas, and it might be fun to have that discussion about what would the approach to allocation be.
Thank you.
Nothing to add?
No comment. Thank you.
I'm here, David.
Josh?
I just wanted to say thanks to Don, John, and Lorelei for coming. It helped this meeting. I also do want to give a little recognition to David that it's a pretty hard job to take all that we said today and condense it down. So I do want to acknowledge that he is spending a lot of time outside of this volunteer time to do private volunteer time to help us get it summarized for the PAC. So I do appreciate that.
Thanks. Pat?
Yes, just ask Lorelei if you could possibly forward, any kind of well information that comes in, along with permits or anything, to the GA, please.
Lorelei. John. Don. I owe thanks to Stetson. Jeff, you're still here, and company for getting this stuff ready, short notice, attending this. Thanks to all who came, and thanks for putting up with my pressurizing this meeting. We needed to hit a deadline. We busted it by a couple minutes, so these guys have time to prepare. But thanks for putting up with that. I think we got most of the issues out, and the GA will hear those, and I think that was the important thing today. Yeah, it's going to be daunting trying to summarize all this, but we do have the video back up as well. So with that, thank you again all. We're adjourned.